Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Katharine Hammond, who, at the time of the fire, was Director of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat in the Cabinet Office. So would you ask Ms Hammond to come in, please?
Good morning.
Good morning, Ms Hammond. Yes, please sit down, make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
All right, ready to continue, I hope?
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr Millett.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Good morning to you. Good morning, members of the panel. Ms Hammond, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Can I take you back, please, by way of introduction for today, to CAB 50157. It's an email string we looked at yesterday afternoon. And I'd like to go in, please, to page 2, which is the email from Stuart. We go to page 2, please. It's the email at 7:13, which copies the email, which is the readout, at 6:16 from Denise Welch at the DCLG.
Yes.
And that's the readout from the 5 a.m. meeting. And if you scroll down to the very foot of the email on page 3, just above where it says next SCG at 6:30, you can see a little block of text that says this: the block is owned by the local authority, LB Kensington and Chelsea, and managed by Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation. Now, did you at this stage, early on the morning of the 14th of June, consider whether there might be a problem with the council effectively operating community engagement if it was simultaneously being, potentially at least, investigated for its role in the fire?
No, I didn't.
Did that factor or idea come into your mind at any stage later on the 14th of June?
So just to be clear, Mr Millett, and apologies, whether being investigated for a role in the fire and performing their statutory duties were in conflict, is that
Yes,
your question?
that's exactly the point.
No, I don't remember considering that, no.
On the 14th? On the 15th? At any stage?
Not to my recollection.
Now let's get back then to the 14th of June first ministerial meeting. We know that the CCS have produced a number of documents in preparation for that meeting, and that included, I think, an attendees list, a brief to the chair, and an agenda. Yes?
Correct.
Yes. Now, in your first statement at paragraph 48, and I don't think we need to go to it, you say you may have discussed the attendees list with Stuart Wainwright to ensure appropriate representation from first responders, national government and local government. Did you discuss the list with Mr Wainwright itself?
So the list would have been prepared by Stuart Wainwright and his team. The way the process would work is they would first set the agenda and agree that with the chair, and then on the back of that work out who should be there. So he may have, in the course of that, asked me for my views. I'm afraid I can't remember the precise conversation at this distance of time.
Well, let's look at the list. It's at CAB 402711. And if we look at the native version of the document, please, we'll see the contents. And if we expand that and scroll down, you can see that from the DCL, well, the chair is Nick Hurd, or to be Nick Hurd, and from number 10, Alistair Whitehead, and then various different attendees from different departments. Scrolling down, you can see you there from, or for the Cabinet Office, together with Stuart Wainwright. We have Catherine Richardson from DCLG, Home Office, David Lamberti, etc., and various other central government bodies,
yes,
including number 10 comms, and then dialing in, if we scroll a bit further down the list, we can see the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, he dials in, and there are people in the back room as well. Now, what you'll see missing from that list is the identification of any individual from RBKC. Did you realise that at the time?
I don't remember having a specific conversation about our BKC attendance. In terms of what we would have been thinking at the time is how is information being fed into this meeting from the local response. And so on the attendees list, you can obviously see the mayor, who would have been getting information through from the SCG. Likewise, the head of the Resilience and Emergencies Division in DCLG, and the ministers to whom they would have been reporting. So I don't remember a specific conversation about RBKC, but in terms of where information about the local authority would have been coming from, that would have been my expectation.
Right. Was it a deliberate decision not to have the chief executive or anybody else from RBKC at this meeting?
I can't recall a specific conversation about the chief executive, no.
Would it have been standard practice, so far as there was a standard practice given the nature of the meeting, but would it have been standard practice to have had the chief executive of the relevant local authority at this meeting?
So there's no, as you allude to, Mr. Bennett, there's no set cast list for meetings of this type. It's assembled based on the agenda and the event. It wouldn't be unusual to have a local authority chief executive in the meeting, but in the context of the presence of the mayor in particular, it wouldn't be automatic.
But do you accept that having the chief executive of the local authority itself, as opposed to the mayor, have given you much better, closer, more first-hand or actual first-hand information?
It might have done so. I can't be specific.
I mean, do you accept that not having Nicholas Holgate, at least on the list of attendees, was a significant omission?
I think at the time we would have been of the view that information about the local authority response could reach the meeting through the SCG route and the mayor's office. You'll be aware of two email chains that we've submitted in evidence, which show a request, I think at about 2 o'clock that afternoon, for Mr. Holgate to join the meeting. Unfortunately, there was a miscommunication surrounding that request, and the operations team, who were dealing with a number of ministerial meetings that day, were not clear that he was being asked to attend this meeting. That, I'm afraid, was a miscommunication on the day, but given the other attendees, it wasn't remarked on to my recollection, because there would have been other sources of that insight.
Well, that would depend, wouldn't it, on how close Sadiq Khan himself personally was to the events on the ground at the time?
No, not him personally. I would expect him to be briefed by his office, and I think I had already received by this point an update from his office which showed to me that they were in touch with the SCG. So reasonable expectation that both he and DCLG were well cited on the operation on the ground.
Can I take you to your third statement, please, and go to paragraph 27. At the foot of the page 11, you say at the very foot of the page, last few words in the third line there, I'm not able to elaborate beyond that based on recall of events, but given his role, and that's Holgate, it would have been normal for him to attend a meeting of this nature. So can we take it that it would have been normal for Nicholas Holgate to attend this meeting?
Yes, normal but not automatic.
No, fair enough. Normal. Now, given that it was normal, on what basis was there a departure from that normal practice?
I don't recall, I'm afraid, a specific conversation about whether or not Mr. Holgate should attend. There obviously was a thought later in the day, the email chain that I've just described to you, but I don't think there was a specific decision that I can recollect not to have him in the meeting.
Right. Do you remember whether the thought process went as follows? We don't have to have Nicholas Holgate there because it would be as good to have Sadiq Khan there.
I don't remember that thought process. I think the point I was trying to make, perhaps not very clearly, was that Mr. Holgate's absence would not have seemed glaring given the presence of other sources of information from the SCG.
Right, so do we take it that neither you nor any other attendee at the meeting raised the lack of representation from RBKC at the meeting or afterwards?
Not to my recollection. I think in the email chains you have, there is a second message from DCLG after the meeting had already commenced, about halfway through, but I'm afraid I wasn't aware of that at the time.
Yes. I mean, do you accept, maybe you don't, that the absence of a representative from RBKC limited what the ministerial meeting could achieve in understanding the real situation on the ground at that time?
I wouldn't have expected that to be the case, no, given the other sources of information that it had.
So was it your understanding that the meeting was approaching Sadiq Khan on the basis that he was, in effect, the local authority Category 1 responder for the purposes of providing information to the meeting and taking away guidance from the meeting?
No, not that he was performing that role, but that the strategic coordinating group, which was bringing together all of the Category 1 responders involved at this moment, information from that group was feeding into this meeting through several routes, one of which was the Mayor's office.
Now, you, I think, attended the meeting yourself, didn't you?
I did.
And you say in paragraph 50 of your statement, let's go to that, please. First witness statement, paragraph 50, page 15. You say that the meeting, and this is the third line, was attended by a mix of ministers, civil servants, first responders, and local government. Which attendees at the meeting are you referring to when you say local government?
I think that is a reference to the Mayor.
That's the Mayor, is it? Now let's go to the minute, please. It's CAB 402714. And you refer to this in paragraph 50 of your statement. And if we go to the bottom of page 1, you can see under the subheading C, support for those affected and families. And it says, there was a discussion around offering trauma counselling to firefighters and ambulance workers involved in the incident. NHS England provided bereavement and trauma counselling services, and these could be made available to those who needed it. Now, although the subtitle there, as we can see, is support for those affected and families, the minute doesn't refer, here or anywhere else, to discussion of the provision of trauma counselling to the bereaved, the survivors and the residents. Was that not discussed in the meeting?
I can't recollect from the meeting. Would it be possible to turn to the next page of this?
Of course,
document?
Let's go to the top of page 2, please.
So the next part of the minute records the discussion particularly around immediate support and rest centres for those who'd been evacuated for the building. That might have included what elements of support were provided there. I'm afraid I don't recall. The actions resulting are recorded on the actions list, I think.
Yes, and we'll look at that if need be on this point. But is it a fact that the focus in the discussions was on the blue light frontline personnel, in this respect at least, rather than the residents and the families of the deceased?
I think the point about frontline personnel is probably drawn out because we were in the very early stages of the response. The conversation about families, I would infer from the minute, was more about holistic rest centre and reception rather than the specific trauma counselling element.
I mean, was there discussion, to the best of your recollection, about providing trauma counselling to the bereaved survivors and residents, as well as the blue light responders?
I can't recollect, I'm afraid, a discussion at this distance. No.
I mean, is there any reason to think that the minute is incomplete in that respect?
So the minute is summarising the discussion rather than providing verbatim account. I wouldn't expect it to be incomplete, but I would also be looking at the evidence in the CRIP to be aware what was already known in the meeting, and I would be looking at the actions list.
Now, looking at what we've got on the screen at the top of the page, page 2, it says, in terms of ensuring that individuals were accounted for, it was suggested that the local authority should have a list of all those who lived in the tower block and would be working through rest centres to follow up with identifying people. What was the source of that contribution, given that Nicholas Holgate wasn't present?
I can't recollect, I'm afraid.
Do you remember whether there was any confirmation that the local authority had such a list, or that this had been discussed with the local authority?
In this meeting?
Yes.
I'm afraid I can't recall a specific discussion.
Let's look at the chair's brief then, which might assist you. It's at CAB 402715. I'll show you the first page of this to identify the document. And it's a document that is entitled Ministerial Meeting on Grenfell Tower Fire, Wednesday, 14th June 2017, 1600. Paragraph 1, you are chairing a ministerial meeting at 1600 hours on the Grenfell Tower Fire. So just identifying the nature of the document, can we take it that this is a briefing document going to Nicholas Hurd?
Correct.
Now, if we go please to page 2 and look at item 3, B, immediate shelter and medium-term housing. We need to scroll down a bit further. Yes, there it is, under immediate shelter and medium-term housing, now in the middle of your screen, Ms. Hammond. Can you see that?
Yes.
There are a number of points. I just want to take them quickly. Point 8 is questions, suggested questions for about arrangements for emergency shelter, alternative accommodation, how long alternative housing may be required, and how challenging that would be for local authorities. And if we look at point 9, a question for DCLG there on which organisations will be managing problems such as dislocation from social networks and key services such as schools and capacity to cope. And over the page, under C, support for those affected and families. You should ask the Home Office, David Lamberti, to outline the management of victim identification and support. You will want to be assured the immediate needs of individuals and families affected are being met and that work is underway to meet their needs over the coming months. Now, I've shown you 3 points out of a number here. Would those questions not best be answered by the Chief Executive of RBKC?
Could we perhaps turn back to the previous page and
yes, of course. Can you go back to
through
page
the
2?
Points?
Yes.
So the first question is addressed to DCLG in expectation that their minister would have been briefed by RED, who were at the SCG that morning. So that's where I would expect that information to come through. There's always a balance in these moments as to whether you draw in those who are busy responding on the ground to answer the questions or whether you draw that information through. So it would be normal to ask that question of DCLG drawing on RED's knowledge. And the second one, likewise. Could we go to the next page? And then in terms of the Home Office question, addressed in that direction because of specific Home Office policy responsibilities in this area, I think.
Yes. But was it the case, though, that asking these central government individuals would only elicit answers which in turn would have to have come from the local authority? Or at least be informed significantly by what the local authority was saying?
I would expect them to have come from the SCG, yes.
Now, the minute, if we can go back to that, CAB 402714 doesn't record discussion of those particular issues. Now, I mean, we can look at it all. Take it from me that it doesn't. But your recollection may be better than the record. Were these questions asked by the chair of the meeting, Nick Hurd?
So I would. My interpretation is that the paragraph at the top of this page records the salient points of the discussion in relation to that question, which was addressed to the Home Office about the identification of individuals. So I would assume that that question was asked, and the conversation concluded that there was an expectation that the local authority would produce the list of those in the tower block, reasonable expectation, and that means of identifying their location would be followed up through rest centres. So my assumption is that that is a response to that question.
Right, but that's you sitting there today working out, as a matter of logic, having seen two separate documents and connecting the two. I'm really interested in your recollection. Let me try this slightly differently. Did you have the questions for ministers, the briefing paper, in your hands when you attended the meeting?
Yes.
You did. Did the meeting follow that? In other words, did Nick Hurd follow his script, so to speak, and go through the questions as written for him?
I'm afraid I can't give you a precise answer to the exact questions he asked in a meeting 5 years ago. I mean, ministers, generally speaking, use the chair's brief quite closely as a guide, but of course, areas of discussion can emerge in the meeting. They may feel more reassured on some areas based on other information. So it's not something they have to follow to the letter, but generally they do.
But you've had many experiences of many high-level meetings. Do you recall whether this was one which stuck to the script in an organised way, or whether it descended, as it were, into a general discussion?
I don't think it descended into a general discussion, but I'm afraid I can't recall precisely which question was and wasn't asked.
Now, the minute doesn't record discussion of other issues relating to the bereaved survivor residents, and I'll give you 4 examples: rest centres, financial assistance, information and support for those looking for their loved ones, and other associated humanitarian needs. Do you know why that is the case?
I don't.
Did you consider that the meeting had been effectively chaired with the right questions being asked about the right topics?
Yes, I think my recollection at the time was that the meeting had agreed a sensible list of actions and broadly done what we expected it to do on that day.
What preparations had you yourself done for that meeting?
Forgive me, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean in terms of my own attendance? Or?
Yes.
So I would have familiarised myself with all of the documents being ready for the meeting. I would have talked to my readiness and response team led by Stuart Wainwright about any issues they were particularly concerned about. And of course, I had been involved in the response through the day, as you've seen from the email chains that you have in your evidence.
Specifically, had you looked at the and there are a lot of them, there are a number of core documents, the London or Pan-London response documents published by London Resilience, and in particular the LE-SLP protocol?
I think it's unlikely I would have done that, but I don't recall specifically.
Were you generally familiar with those documents?
I'm familiar with the London arrangements as set out in the CCA. My resilience capabilities team were more expert than I was on the specifics of how they were operated within London.
At all events, were you familiar at the time with the nature of centres to be established in London, either by the Metropolitan Police or by the local authority, by which I mean rest centres, survivor reception centres, humanitarian assistance centres, and friends and relatives reception centres?
Do you mean familiar with the types of centre that
Yes.
might be established, or the locations? The types of centres, yes, not an expert on, but familiar with the different concepts.
And were there questions asked at the meeting about whether each of those different types of centres was being considered?
I'm afraid I can't add to my previous answer. I don't recollect a specific conversation about rest centres.
If we go back then to page 1 of the minute, under the subheading B, there's a title, Immediate Shelter and Medium-Term Rehousing, and it says, the local council were presently identifying temporary accommodation for those residents of Grenfell Tower. Longer-term rehousing would also be the responsibility of the council. The council were not currently asking for additional support. What was the source of that information, given the absence of Nicholas Holgate?
I think it would have been provided by a DCLG minister or by the head of the Resilience and Emergencies Division based on their attendance at the SCG, where, of course, the council would have been present.
Now let's look at a different document, CAB 30133811, please. What I'd like to do is to have this document, please, up at the same time as the previous minute we've been looking at CAB 402714. Now, I want to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting, if I can, please. My first question is, did you know that there were different versions of the minute of the meeting on the 14th of June?
No, there may be an earlier draft and the finalised draft. That would be normal.
Now, what I want to show you is the one on the right is the one we were looking at before.
Yes.
The one on the left, which has 13811 as the final digits in the reference, is a different version. If we look at the one on the left, under key issues, subheading B, immediate shelter and medium-term rehousing, if we can scroll down a bit so we can see the whole paragraph. Yes. That reads, the Minister for Local Government stated that the local council were presently identifying temporary accommodation for those residents of Grenfell Tower. Longer-term rehousing would also be the responsibility of the council. The Mayor of London pressed for further reassurance and requested that contact was made with the local council to ensure that affected individuals are not left without accommodation. And then compare that with the different version on the right-hand side, which is the one you exhibited to your statement at KH7, which says, under the same title, the local council were presently identifying a temporary accommodation for those residents of Grenfell Tower. Longer-term rehousing would also be the responsibility of the council. The council were not currently asking for additional support. Now, the reference to as you can see on the left-hand side, the Mayor of London pressed for further reassurance and requested that contact was made with the local council to ensure that affected individuals are not left without accommodation, appears to have been removed or not yet inserted, depending on which version came first. Are you able to help us about why it is that line in the left-hand side doesn't appear on the right-hand side, which is the version that you exhibited?
I'm afraid I'm not. They look to me like two different versions, in the drafting process of creating the minute. I would need to go back to the files to work out in which order they came and talk to the drafter to understand why they amended their notes. Normally, people taking minutes of these meetings take a longhand note and then they refer back to it to amend and improve the minutes afterwards. But I would need to talk to that person, I'm afraid.
Well, all right, but you exhibited the one on the right-hand side as an exhibit to your statement. When you did so, were you aware that there were at least two versions of this document?
I hadn't looked at other drafts of it, no.
Are you able to tell us whether the one you exhibited was the one that was the final version, or that it wasn't, and that the final version was the one on the left?
I think in exhibiting it, my assumption would have been that was the final version, but I wasn't aware of the other one, so I would need to go away and confirm that that's correct.
Well, you say it was an assumption. Did you receive a final version of the minutes at the time?
So the minutes would not be circulated to me. They would be placed in a filing system to which I would have access if I needed to refer back to it.
Right. Can you think of any reason why you would have exhibited only a draft of the minute as opposed to the final version?
It certainly wouldn't have been a conscious decision to exhibit a draft.
No. Can we proceed, therefore, on the basis that the one you exhibited was the final version? Can we proceed with reasonable confidence on that basis?
I think you can proceed that I had assumed that at the time of exhibiting it. Again, I wasn't aware of the other version, so I would need to go and confirm that.
Right. Were minutes of the ministerial meeting circulated in draft to attendees for confirmation after the meeting?
No, the normal practice after a meeting was that the actions, which are the things that need to be addressed rapidly, would be circulated to all attendees very quickly. The minutes are taken purely for the record. Anybody who needed to refer to them would come to CCS and ask to do so.
Can I just ask you this? I note that in the minutes on the left-hand side of the screen, the identity of the person giving the information is stated. So the Minister of State for Health said something, and then the Minister for Local Government said something. Now,
Yep.
those who were present at the meeting must have known who had made those statements,
Yes.
but for some reason, the identities don't appear in the version on the right-hand side. Can you explain that?
No, I can't. It's normal practice to make reference to the person making a point, and it goes to my point. I can't be sure which of these is the earlier draft. I would need to go and confirm that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Can you explain, well, if you look at the version on the left-hand side, which doesn't include the sentence, the council were not currently asking for additional support, which is the last sentence in the version on the right-hand side. Can you explain how that line came to be added to the right-hand side version, the version you exhibited, when it wasn't in the left-hand side version?
I don't think I can add to my statement a moment ago. I would need to go and investigate the order of these drafts.
Well, then, can you explain why it was deleted? One way or the other. It was either added or it was deleted. There's no other alternative. So can you explain why there's a difference?
I'm afraid I can't without further investigation, no.
Do you remember what the nature of the concerns of the mayor were in relation to immediate shelter and temporary accommodation?
I can't recollect the conversation, I'm afraid, so I would be drawing on the paperwork. I don't think I can add to that.
You see, he's recorded there as pressing for further reassurance and requesting that contact was made with the local council to ensure that affected individuals are not left without accommodation. Are you really sure that it's right that the meeting passed without any concern being expressed about the absence of Nicholas Holgate or anyone else from RBKC at this meeting?
I've got no recollection of a conversation about the absence of Mr. Holgate. That point I would interpret to mean the mayor wanting to be assured that that action was in hand. I don't think that is necessarily in opposition to the statement that additional support wasn't currently being sought, but I'm interpreting the documents now.
I mean, do you accept, looking at that it would have been much better had Nicholas Holgate been at the meeting, because then the Mayor of London would have pressed for reassurance directly from him?
It's possible that would have assisted the Mayor in getting that reassurance, yes.
Can we then go to CAB 401236? This is the action list that you referred to earlier this morning. And you can see it is headed actions. And in Action 2, Department for Communities and Local Government to liaise with Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council regarding the urgent provision of temporary accommodation for those displaced from the Grenfell Tower. Was your understanding that DCLG had not liaised previously with RBKC on that issue?
I don't think I had at that point a clear view on what conversations had and hadn't happened between DCLG and RBKC. That action, in my reading, is asking DCLG to assure itself that the council does not need support, even though they may not have been asking for it.
Well, that's a reading, isn't it, as you say? Another reading could be that DCLG needed to liaise with the local authority in order to make sure that they were doing what they were supposed to, vis-à-vis the provision of temporary accommodation.
I don't think your statement and mine are dramatically different, but you asked me whether that was the first contact. I don't know, I'm afraid. That would be a question for DCLG. They had, of course, been present at the SCGs, where I would expect the local authority to have been present.
When you say it's a question for the DCLG, I'm really asking about your own understanding as someone who was there. Was it your understanding that this action had arisen because DCLG had not previously liaised with RBKC on that issue?
That's not a point I recollect, no.
Do you recall whether this was listed as an action precisely because of the Mayor of London's request, as we've seen in the left-hand version of the minute, that contact be made with the local council on this very issue?
I mean, actions summarise the outcome of a section of discussion normally, so it may or may not have been prompted by a specific intervention by one individual.
From your recollection, doing the best you can, what was the general impression you had of the first meeting, about how the local council was handling the response thus far?
I think my overall impression of the meeting was that there were no requests for help and assistance across the board, and nobody was flagging significant concerns with the response at that point. But we would always continue to ask the questions going forward.
So following that meeting, you didn't have any concerns regarding the effectiveness of the support from RBKC? I think that's what you're telling us, is that right?
I don't recall having specific concerns about RBKC. We would have been asking questions about all elements of the response and continuing to assure ourselves that it was doing what was necessary. I don't recall RBKC being a specific focus in that moment.
Now, let's then see what happens after the meeting. Can we go, please, to your first statement, paragraph 53 at page 16. At the close of 14th of June 2017, you say, I felt that CCS had responded as it should do. The central government response mechanism was activated swiftly. The first ministerial meeting drew together a good mix of people with response roles at the right levels from both within and from outside government. The chair had been properly briefed and the meeting achieved what it needed to. Do you think that's right, looking back on it?
Yes, I think that is how I felt at the end of that day.
Right. Now, let's move on in the day. Can we please go to CAB 3014358? And if you look at the email, it comes from Isla Hurley-Brunt, who is an assistant director in community resilience and recovery, sitting in the Cabinet Office. And it's sent to Ian Whitehouse, also within the Cabinet Office, subject quick readout, Grenfell recovery. Now, I'm sorry that it's not terribly clear on your screen, perhaps, but what she says in the third paragraph there is this: I'm concerned about handling the gap in the victim support piece. As this isn't a, quote, crime at this stage, I don't know what kicks in to support families with missing people where there hasn't been a confirmed death. Bracket, DVI is going to take quite a while, close bracket. It's likely that this will emerge quite quickly. There will be further strain on mental health provision, both for public stroke residents, but also several hundred FFs, stroke ambulance and call handlers, lots of talking to trapped people for long periods of time, etc. Danny Cotton has flagged the need for additional support, and NHS England have offered their bereavement advice. Now, did you consider there to be a gap in the victim support piece, as she says?
I think we were asking questions about victim support throughout that week. What Isla is doing, I think, is working through the list of issues we would expect to be considered and reflecting she didn't have a clear understanding of the victim support arrangements in the event where a family is not yet confirmed to have been bereaved. As you see, I'm not copied into this email chain specifically.
No, but from what you knew at the time, was there a concern about a gap in the victim support piece, as she records?
Well, I think Isla was recalling handling the gap in the victim support.
Well, there wouldn't be a
piece.
gap that had to be handled unless there was a gap.
I mean,
Well, my question. Let me put the question again.
Please.
I mean, you I imagine, still in the office on the evening of the 14th of June,
Yes.
and still in touch with with your colleagues, do you recall a discussion about whether there was a gap in the victim support piece?
I can't recall a specific conversation, I'm afraid, at this distance.
Looking back on it, do you recall thinking perhaps later that there was a structural or policy gap in that respect, the respect that she identifies here?
So I think there is an action from a ministerial meeting the next day or perhaps the following day which initiated the setting up of the victims unit. So that, I think, is the culmination of conversations about whether the right level of victim support was being provided. So there was certainly a concern emerging through that time. I don't remember a specific conversation on the 14th, I'm afraid.
Right, and we'll come to see a little bit about the victim support unit later. Let's move on in the day then. CAB 407180, please. This is an email at 2119. Now, it's rather difficult to see it, but it's the second email down, and it's an FYI to which you reply, "Thank you, Michael," at the top of the screen. We'll just go to the very top of the screen first, and then I'll show you the message that you actually get. You reply to yourself, I think, but that's fairly standard. It goes into the CCF system, and it goes to Stuart Wainwright. It's a "Thank you, Michael," and it comes from through the FYI from somebody called Michael, and beneath that you can see it's an email from Fiona Stone at 20:49 on the 14th of June, which is sent into MHCLG Red and CCS. Notes from the 1930 multi-agency SCG. Now I've identified the document. It says in bold, the key messages are: this will be a very protracted recovery and coronial process. We cannot make this better for the families affected, but we need to ensure we do not make things worse for them. Key issues, and then it goes on over the page. And if we scroll down on page 2, please, to current situation in bold, a quarter of the way down your screen, you can see 4 paragraphs down from that. It says vulnerable people. Do you see?
Yes.
Vulnerable people and families have been given accommodation overnight. Hotel as a priority. This is 44 families from the tower and 25 from the surrounding area. There is still a shortfall of accommodation. Further humanitarian, it goes on, further humanitarian, before that, a little bit down below that, after LA rest centres, some heated flare-ups between individuals, especially regarding media intrusion, but all handled quickly, no other issues. The Westway Rest Centre will stay open overnight for those who have not been provided with alternative accommodation. And then further humanitarian assistance centres will open tomorrow. The terminology, whether this is a Friends and Family Reception Centre, FRC, or a Humanitarian Assistance Centre, HAC, will be firmed up once needs of the community identified. Further details to come, be organised overnight. Now, did you read the readout when you were forwarded it on that evening?
Yes, I think my response indicates acknowledgement and receipt of it. Yes, at 9:30 that night.
Yes, but you would have, presumably you would have read.
I would have scrolled through it. Yes.
Yes. Having read it, were you concerned then about the support being provided to those affected, and in particular the shortfall of accommodation?
I think having read that, yes, we would have logged that as an issue to pick up in the following day's work. I would also, I think, have registered that the action you referred to a moment ago for DCLG to work with the local authority on accommodation provision should assist with that issue. So, yes, I think I would have registered that as an issue that needed focus the following day.
I see. And what would you have done the following day, having focused on it?
So I would expect the response team to have been looking into that issue, to be talking to DCLG about the outcome of their conversations with the local authority and what help they might need. I'd expect those conversations to go on through the day and to feed into anything that might require a ministerial decision in the meeting later that afternoon.
Did you see any significance in the fact that there was as yet no FRRC, Friends and Family Reception Centre?
I can't recollect, I'm afraid.
Did you see any significance in the fact that there was a doubt about whether what would open the next day would be an FRRC or a humanitarian assistance centre?
I can't recollect, forgive me, my specific response to that line, but I note that it says that community needs were being identified and the type of centre would be based on that evidence, and that would be fairly normal.
Right. Did you know that they weren't the same, that the FRRC wasn't the same as an HAC?
As I said before, I was familiar with the different types, but not a deep expert in the way some of my team were.
Did you consider at the time what the arrangements were on the ground for how families could get news of their loved ones who had been in the tower?
So I think that was touched on in the readout of the meeting you referred to before, that the rest centre was leading on registering and identifying those who were missing.
And the rest centre being what? Is that Westway or somewhere else in your understanding?
I think the Westway, in my understanding at that time, or whatever location was being used in that moment.
Were you clear about it?
About the location?
Yes.
I can't remember, I'm afraid. My recollection is that the Westway was the location we were most familiar with.
Location for overnight sleeping that night, but also, is this right, for a hub for information for family members who were searching for their loved ones? Is that how you understood it?
Yes, it was the first point of contact centre that had been set up. That's not a term of art, it's just a description of what it was doing.
Let's then turn to the 15th of June. If we go, please, to CAB 402231. We can see at the foot of page 1 an email from Stuart Wainwright to Catherine Richardson and Robert Mason in red, copied to others in the CCS, and I would imagine that would include you.
I don't think I am on that copy list.
You're not
no.
specifically so, but it says copy CCS. Would you not have seen this?
I think that would probably, I don't know what specifically is redacted, but I think it's likely to be the central mailbox.
Yes. So you would have seen, no doubt, or at least could have accessed it.
I could have accessed it. I can't remember if I
Right.
did, I'm afraid.
Well, the text says, "Hey, CLG folks, any readouts from SCGs today? I think the last we saw was last night's. Stuart." Now, were you aware at that point, and this is just after noon on the 15th, that no readout from the 11 a.m. SCG on that day had been provided to the CCS?
I'm afraid I can't recall whether I knew at noon whether the meeting had been read out to us or not, no.
If we go to your first statement, then, paragraph 57 on page 17, you say there, in the last sentence, 3 lines up from the bottom, "I recall that I was personally in contact with David Bellamy, the Mayor of London's Chief of Staff, who provided another source of information about the on-the-ground situation." That's right, is it? You were in touch with him?
I recollect being in touch with him.
You recollect that?
Periodically throughout these days.
Right. You say that you recall that he provided another source of information about the on-the-ground situation. What did you discuss with him about the on-the-ground situation?
Specifically at noon on the 15th?
Yes.
I'm afraid I can't recall exactly when I spoke to him on the 15th. My general recollection is that the readouts from him accorded, broadly speaking, with the readouts coming from RED via the SCG. They were both based on the same meeting, right, generally.
How are we to read this sentence in your statement? Are you saying that you recall that you were in contact with Mr. Bellamy and that as a matter of course he would provide you with information about the on-the-ground situation? Or are you saying that you recall the conversation on that day and that he provided information about the on-the-ground situation in it?
So I think this sentence doesn't refer to a specific conversation. It refers to the fact that he and I were in touch throughout that period.
Right. Did he share any further concerns about accommodation for those affected, as appears to have been raised by the Mayor at the ministerial meeting at 4 o'clock the previous day?
At what time?
At the time when you were in contact with David Bellamy?
So this is referring to a chain of contact rather than a specific conversation. As I said, his concerns accorded with the readouts coming from Red from the SCG, and in the readout you've just referred to, that is recording some issues with accommodation. So I would imagine he would also have relayed a similar point.
Right. I just want to understand your evidence a bit more clearly. You say in the first part of this paragraph that it had been decided that a second meeting would take place on the 15th of June, and the surrounding paragraphs are all set within the 15th of June.
Yes.
And then you go on to say, I recall that I was personally in contact with David Bellamy. But were you in contact with him on the 15th of June?
I can't recall a specific instance on the 15th of June, I'm afraid, but we were generally in touch by various means through those few days.
Right. And being generally in touch, do you recall at any stage whether he shared with you further concerns about accommodation for those affected, as had been raised by Sadiq Khan at the 4 o'clock meeting on the 14th of June?
I can't recall a specific point, but I think it's very likely, given that he was drawing on both the Mayor's views and the readout from the SCG, which, as you've seen, was recording some issues with accommodation.
Now, if we scroll down to paragraph 60 of your statement, same page, you say this: prior to the second ministerial meeting, the CCS view remained that local responders, that is, the Fire and Rescue Service, ambulance and police, were adequately resourced to deal with the fire. The basis of this view, that there were no issues regarding resources, was principally information from the SCG as provided to CCS by DCLG Red as part of its liaison role, and also conversations with colleagues in the Home Office. Now, the emphasis here is, when discussing local responders, is on the fire and rescue, ambulance and police, not RBKC. Looking at the paragraph, that's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yes. And now, at this point, you didn't know, did you, whether RBKC itself was adequately resourced to deal with the aftermath of the fire, did you?
I think at the meeting on the meeting of the previous day and the readout of the SCG later that night, which was starting to flag accommodation issues, would have meant that we were confident about fire and rescue, ambulance and police at this point, but aware that there were some emerging issues around those areas led by the local authority. And I think you can see that play through into the Chair's brief for the meeting this afternoon.
Right, so the focus of paragraph 60 is solely the blue light services. Is that right?
I think that is, it's worded to reflect that where our confidence lay at that moment, and having seen the SCG readout, that would be right, I think.
Right. Now then, let's look at Stuart Wainwright's statement, his first statement, please. CAB 3014776. And I'd like to show you page 8, paragraph 29, which is now on the screen at the foot of your screen. And he says this: during the course of the day on the 15th of June 2017, I became more concerned about whether individuals affected by the fire were being looked after. This was mainly on the basis of discussions with DCLG, who had been attending SCG meetings and who were not seeing a clear plan for managing this being communicated at this time. Whilst I did not have a clear sense at this stage of whether there was a significant problem or not in terms of providing adequate accommodation. We can turn the page, please. In terms of providing adequate accommodation and support to those affected by the fire, it was apparent, given the lack of a clear plan, as DCLG reported, that this would need to be an issue that required attention that day, including at the afternoon's ministerial meeting. Now, you, I think, well, first, did Mr. Wainwright communicate these concerns to you ahead of the then scheduled 15:30 meeting on the 15th of June?
We would have discussed the contents of the chair's brief and the status of the response, and the chair's brief contains suggestions to probe on a number of these areas. So yes, we would have talked about that.
Would I be right in thinking that you didn't raise the issue of RBKC's capacity with DCLG Red before that second ministerial meeting?
I don't have a record of having done so or a recollection of having done so.
Now, ahead of the 15:30 meeting, there was an action tracker, wasn't there? We can see that. Let's go to it. CAB 401253. Do you recall that was circulated before the meeting?
Yes, this is a document that CCS compiles to keep track of previously agreed action. So not necessarily circulated, but it's a document Stuart and his team would have been using. Right.
Well, we do have emails showing that it was circulated to those dialing in. I mean, I don't need to go to that unless you want me to.
No,
Take
that's
that
fine.
from me that it was circulated. I think you've just explained, just to be clear, this was a tool, was it, by which progress would be tracked against each action?
Correct.
Now, in terms of the actions from the first ministerial meeting, let's look at action 2, which you can see on the screen towards the bottom. Department for Communities and Local Government to liaise with Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council regarding the urgent provision of temporary accommodation for those displaced from the Grenfell Tower. You see that? And if you look at the corresponding progress update in the middle column, it says, DCLG have raised this issue with the local authority, but a full picture of the adequacy of the accommodation has yet to emerge. Now, just pausing there, were you concerned by that update?
Yeah, so I think this is part of the overall picture around this issue that was emerging on the morning of the 15th, which then fed into the chair's brief. So yes, I mean, as Stuart's statement set out, the response team in CCS was starting to be concerned about this issue.
Right. And did that response team include you?
But they report to me, yes.
But did you share their concerns?
I think having read the SCG report the previous night and being in close contact with them, I would have been aware of that issue as well.
Aware of it and concerned about it?
Absolutely.
Yes. Action 3, please, if we look at that. Metropolitan Police, no update from CLG provided. And I think I need to go to the top of page 2 to finish the left-hand column off. Department for Communities and Local Government to liaise on improving our understanding of the number of people displaced from the building. And if we just go back to the foot of page 1, you can see it records no update from CLG provided. Were you concerned, was your team concerned by the fact that there was no update yet provided from the CLG on that question?
Yeah, so I think Stuart says in his statement it's not unusual in the early stages of a response for it to be difficult to get a handle on precise numbers. Certainly, I think a concern about this arose through the day on the 15th and crystallised in the ministerial meeting when it became clear that the local authority didn't have those numbers at their fingertips.
Looking back at page 2, you can see that the liaison was to be on improving our understanding. That's, I think, is this right? CCS's, or perhaps central governments more widely, of the number of people displaced from the building. And the building was what? Grenfell Tower?
The building referred to, I think, is Grenfell Tower. That would have included anybody displaced as a consequence of the fire, I think.
That's the question. Was your understanding that the focus at this point was on those displaced from the tower, as opposed to those displaced from the surrounding blocks?
I don't think it's a distinction we would have drawn in that way. It's just referring to those who've been displaced as a consequence.
I see. Now, we have the meeting at 15:30 on that day, and you attended along with Mr. Wainwright, yes?
Forgive me. Yes, correct.
Yes, and it was chaired by Nicholas Hurd, again.
Correct.
And if we look at the minutes, please, we find those at CAB 402720. And you can see the attendees at this meeting.
Yes.
And again, its title is the ministerial meeting at 15:30, Friday, 15th June. Present Nick Hurd in the chair, and you can see the various ministers present set out on that page. And you can also see who is dialing in. Nicholas Holgate, Chief Executive, at the foot of your screen, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Neil Jerome from the Metropolitan Police, and Dominic Ellis from the NFB. Now, if we go please to page 3, under key issues, you can see subsection A, immediate shelter and medium-term rehousing. It records as follows: those affected were being placed into hotels for immediate shelter, with 77 from Grenfell Tower and 25 people from the surrounding area in hotels. A large number of people are assumed to have gone to stay with friends and family, though the Westway Centre had capacity for 300 to stay and only 30 were there the previous night. Given that there was a lack of clarity about the exact numbers of those affected, do you agree that there was no appreciation of the scale of the issue in relation to accommodation?
I think there was a lack of precision in the numbers. This records the understanding of scale at that time. It was the lack of specifics that was of concern.
Specifics in what respect?
Specific numbers of people who were known to have been in the tower that night.
Yes. Now, at this point, were you aware, or to your observation, were others aware at the meeting that there were approximately 845 people evacuated from nearby properties who also required accommodation, at least in the very short term?
I don't think we had that specific number, and that was the source of the concern.
Right. Now, if we go to your first statement then again, please, page 18.
Well, sorry, did you know that the blocks immediately adjacent to the tower had been evacuated?
I believe we knew there had been knock-on effects. I don't think we knew that the number of people who had been affected, and that's the source of some of the concern about the data coming through.
But presumably you didn't need precise numbers if you were looking at the scale of the demand for temporary housing. But
I think the scale of the demand as reflected here was diminished by the fact that lots of people found a friend or a family member to stay with. Mm-hmm. So what we were trying to do at the time is understand the totality of the number of people who could have been affected, and of them, how many were in need of specific support, and how many had resolved that issue for themselves, as is often the case.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
If we then go to page 18 of your statement, your first statement, please, paragraph 62 now. You say the meeting opened with an update on the current situation and operational response. The majority of the time was taken up with discussion of two key issues: immediate shelter and medium-term housing, and support for those affected and their families. These were issues on which I would have expected RBKC to lead, drawing on support from others as needed. However, I recall being a little concerned that there was an absence of data which a local authority might have been expected to have readily available, most notably the numbers of tenants in Grenfell Tower. Mr. Holgate was also unable to articulate any plan beyond the immediate for rehousing or supporting those affected, or what resources would be needed from outside RBKC for that to occur. My overall impression from Mr. Holgate at the 15th June 2017 meeting was that RBKC was overwhelmed by the requirements of its role in relation to the fire. Now, let me just show you first of all what Stuart Wainwright says. But first of all, can we take it that you stand by what you say there?
I do.
You do. Now, looking at what Stuart Wainwright says, this is in his first statement, page 9, paragraph 30. That's CAB 3014776, please. He says at paragraph 30, and we can pick this up 3 lines down, on the issue of housing, Mr. Holgate was unable to articulate a clear plan, simply saying that it was in hand. He was not able to say, for instance, how many people would require accommodation, what services they needed, what resources RBKC had to deliver these, or what support it would need to do so. I believe the concerns at this meeting were shared by other attendees, and that is why a number of the agreed actions, particularly actions 4 and 5, were directed to resolving this. Do you agree with what he says there?
Yes, I think that paragraph is consistent with the paragraph in my statement. So yes.
Well, it is. That's something that both you and I can agree on without having to be there. But does it accord with your recollection? That was my question.
Yes, my statement is based on my recollection.
And now, you also say, and I've shown you this, that your overall impression at the meeting was that RBKC was overwhelmed by the requirements of its role in relation to the fire. Could you just expand on that for us, please?
I think in a meeting like this, generally those responders in a leadership role have information at their fingertips. They're able to articulate where they have clarity on what they're going to do and where they have yet to have that clarity, but how they will reach it. And as you can see from Stuart's description and from mine, those elements were lacking. So there was a perception there of lack of grip.
Right. You say lack of grip. That seems to be a term of art. At least others have suggested it is. And we see it all over central government and resilience documents. But just identify with greater precision what that actually means. What was it that you would have expected Mr. Holgate to have articulated with clarity that you weren't getting from him, which led to the impression that he was overwhelmed?
I would have expected him to be able to give a clear account of the number of people requiring support from the local authority, and I would have expected him to be able to articulate the plan for that, how that would be delivered in more detail than was the case in the meeting. And Stuart records him saying it was in hand, but not describing that further.
Did you or Stuart Wainwright ask him any specific pointed questions, detailed questions, such as, is there a humanitarian assistance centre? Where is it? What's it doing? Is there a friends and relatives reception centre, etc.?
I can't recall either of us asking that question in the meeting, for which we were, of course, providing the Secretariat.
Can you tell us why this question, the general questions about housing, where it is said that Mr. Holgate couldn't offer an articulate plan, wasn't raised at the meeting the previous day? What had changed since 4 p.m. on the Wednesday afternoon by the time of the Thursday afternoon?
So I think looking back at the evidence that we have looked at this morning, clearly this was an issue which the SCG was now focusing on and had been since late the previous evening. I would expect that to be the first place at which these kind of issues were arisen. So I think that the factor that has changed is that visibility, first through the SCG, had improved. Right.
Now, let's turn to what happened after the meeting. Can you remember what actions you took after the 15:30 ministerial meeting, given your concerns that you felt at that meeting that RBKC had become overwhelmed?
Do you mean specific actions actioned in the meeting?
No, actions following the meeting, consequent upon the meeting.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, so I think a short time after the meeting, forgive me, I can't recall the exact time now, I had an email exchange with colleagues in DCLG, which was really sense checking whether they shared those concerns and suggesting that someone more senior in DCLG should make contact with the local authority to really get to the bottom of what was going on.
Well, let's cover those. Let's start with CAB 402899. And I'm going to run through this, I think, as chronologically as I can on that evening. This, I think, is out of chronology, but I don't think it matters. This is, if you go to page 1, an email, second email down if you go to it, Sue Gray in the Cabinet Office.
Yes.
To you, thank you so much, but I think you've given her an update. Well, you shared with her an update which had come. And she thanks you, and she asks you, how was your ministerial meeting? And you say this to her. Not bad, very tired NH. Who is NH?
I think that refers to the chair.
Right, not Nicholas Holgate?
No.
You can see how that question arises.
Indeed, same initials.
Why was NH, Nicholas Hurd, very tired? What was the problem with him?
So these meetings were taking place very shortly after the general election of that year. Ministers had only been appointed in some cases a day or two before. I think we were just seeing the aftermath of some of that.
Right.
I don't think it affected his ability to chair the meeting at all.
Well, that was my next question. It didn't. And he goes on to say, local authority chief exec did not inspire confidence, though. We'll keep an eye on that. Mm-hmm. We don't need the rest of it. How are you going to keep an eye on that?
So we would continue to track it through the action process and the meeting process. And the we there, I think, refers to the government effort. So DCLG were clearly already in contact. So I'm referring in part to that as well, I think.
Did you make any contact with the Home Office as lead government department for the response to raise your concerns, as expressed here, about RBKC?
I wouldn't have made those concerns to the Home Office because DCLG, as a lead department, both for the local authority sector and for the recovery, of which this is really now a key part or starting to become a key part, it would have been for them to lead on that relationship. So no.
Now, you say in your statement, first statement of paragraph 64, that you sent an email to DCLG to seek their view about whether your impression about RBKC was correct. Let's look at that. It's at CAB 402896. And if we go to page 2 in that email run, we can see an email at 19:57 that evening. So that's just before your email to Sue Gray. Mm-hmm. Second email down on page 2. Yes. You write, hello, good to see you both today. Would it make sense to rearrange our catch-up tomorrow given the ongoing incident?
Just as a point of clarity, that's not me.
That's Katharine Richardson.
That's Katharine Richardson, yes.
Yes, you're right. And then you respond to that, a copy to Gillian J. And you say, hi, Katharine, yes, I suspect we will be in 10 VS, that's Victoria Street, again at that point. Would be good to take stock with you on the local authority, though, and how they are doing outside the wider meeting. Now, you make reference to the local authority, unprompted by Katharine Richardson's question to you there, yes?
Yes.
Yes. You don't ask her, though, whether your impression from the meeting was correct, did you?
So I think, could we go to the next email in the chain?
Yes, page 1, we can do that.
Yes. So the second part of that, of the final email in the chain, or penultimate email in the chain, excuse me, is me recording my concerns from that meeting, and asking the last question is essentially me testing my assumptions with Katharine and with Gillian.
Yes, I mean, I was going to take you through this a bit more slowly, but we can take it more quickly because you're familiar with it. But so you don't ask her about her impressions in that email. She comes back, foot of page 1, and says, thanks, one step forward with the inquiry. And you go back to her and say, no problemo, 3.5 years of my life put to good use. Finally, I think we know what that's a reference to, but we don't need to go into it. On the LA, I wondered if Jay might want to put in a call to chief exec, so to speak, and give her view. She may already have, I guess. The numbers issue were worrying me today, especially on how many flats were council tenants versus in private hands. Surely a sensible person with access to their files could be working out that and decent estimates of occupancy, tenants plus electoral register plus council tax. That's what you say. And she thanks you for that in response, 2103. Thanks, Katharine. Yes, Joe has already spoken to Nick Holgate, offering specific support on the housing issue. Our housing minister is also intending to speak to Nick, the housing director and or cabinet member for housing tomorrow. Between them, they'll be getting into the detail we didn't have today. And it rounds off at the top with the reference to feeding into the chairman's brief. Now, why weren't you more direct in your questions to DCLG Red about the fact that RBKC were overwhelmed and what steps you perceive needed to be taken by Red?
I think that is quite direct. These are colleagues that I know very well. they would have known that me writing to express that concern was setting out, a genuine worry. And Catherine's response said to me that they shared those concerns because their Director General had already spoken to the Chief Executive, and they clearly had plans for further conversations. So I think on the basis of that exchange, I was confident that we were sharing the same worries about the performance of the local authority.
Right. Did you know by that stage, on the 15th of June, that that Nicholas Holgate had agreed with John Barradell to, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, to activate London Gold?
I don't think I did know that, no.
Right. Was that something you should have known, given that it might have materially affected your views of the local authority and its needs going forward?
It's not something I would have expected to have been consulted on. I would have expected to find out, reasonably swiftly afterwards if it had a material impact on the response. I think, in fact, I found out very early the following morning. I think that's correct.
Now, at the top of the email string, you suggest a catch-up the next day, 16th. Did that catch-up happen?
I can't recollect. There certainly would have been lots of contact between the response team and DCLG through the morning. Right.
Do you know what the next thing was that you discussed with DCLG that next morning?
I'm afraid not. I can't recall.
Now let's round off the day then at paragraph 65 of your first statement at page 19. And Mr. Chairman, looking at the clock, it will be a convenient moment after this.
Yeah, well, let's take this first, shall we?
If we may, thank you. And you say there at paragraph 65 as follows: at the close of 15th June 2017, I remained of the view that emergency response mechanism for which CCS is responsible was working well. The right people were given the right information to generate the right decisions and recommendations. My concern was with the capacity of RBKC to cope, which I considered that the relevant government department, DCLG, was aware of and considering how to act on. What exactly was the emergency response mechanism that you say was working well?
That's a reference to the ministerial meetings being convened.
Right. Were you at the time confident that DCLG had sufficient capacity and expertise within it to deal with the concerns about RBKC?
I can't recall having a specific view on capacity at that moment. I think the email chains show that DCLG was still in the process of understanding the scale of the ask which might come to them. So I think it would have been difficult to be clear on capacity at that moment.
With hindsight, perhaps, do you accept that you should have been more proactive in probing DCLG Red about exactly what was going to be done to address the problems and concerns about RBKC?
No, I don't think so. I mean, those are colleagues that I knew very well, and their response reassured me that they were on the case, that they'd taken this to very senior levels in their department, that they had further plans for contact even at ministerial level. So it looked to me like it was being taken very seriously, and it was within their area of responsibility. So on that basis, I don't think it would have been helpful for me to have probed further.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, Ms. Hammond, we will have our morning break at that point. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
Of course.
All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Millett. 25 to 12, please. Would you ask Miss Hammond to come back in, please? Right, Miss Hammond, on we go. Yes. Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hammond, the 16th of June, the Friday, let's turn to that. Now, do you remember whether there was a handover from Stuart Wainwright to Peter Tallentire on that evening, on the evening of the 15th of June?
Yes, I think that's correct. Stuart and Peter have given evidence on that.
And, well, they have, but do you recall that?
I can't remember if I was present at that handover, no.
Right. Now, Peter Tallentire, just to identify him, he was the head of the crisis management team within the CCS, wasn't he?
He was head of the operations team, so the team which was responsible in particular for the provision of the sites and the doctrine.
And he was very experienced.
Extremely experienced, yes.
Yes. And I think Stuart Wainwright was handing over because he was about to go on annual leave.
Correct. So Peter had previously been in the role that Stuart was in at that time, so he was very well versed in how to do that job.
Yes. Now, there were a number of developments over the course of the morning of Friday, the 16th of June. I'm going to show you in turn. And first, let's look at correspondence from the Home Office, who were the lead government department in this response. Can we start, please, with CAB 30120037, page 2. And I'd like to go to page 2, and an email at 8:56 at the top of that page from FMIN-PS to the office of Sajid Javid, copy to the office of Alok Sharma, and you. You see that?
Yes.
And FMIN-PS, I think, is Fire Minister, Private Secretary. So it's Nick Hurd, isn't it?
His office, yes.
Yeah, so it's coming from the Home Office, effectively, yes?
Coming from the Minister of State for Policing and the Fire Service, yes.
Right.
In the Home Office.
In the Home Office, yes, thank you. Now, you're copied into this, and it says, hi, James, Tom, with many thanks, Tom, for your time on the phone. The Minister is receiving direct feedback this morning from the coordination on the ground in terms of, 1, connecting families, and 2, coordinating the volunteer effort is not quite there yet and is perceived as, quotes, chaotic, close quotes. He feels it would be helpful for us collectively to identify who is actually responsible for coordinating both efforts, as in a person, and what, if any, more support they may need. I understand this is likely to sit within RBKC and be one of their senior officials, ? Would it be possible for DCLG colleagues to check this out? Happy to do so from here, but I don't want to cut across your lines of communication with the Council. Thanks, Deborah. And that comes from Deborah Morrison, who is Nick Hurd's PS. Yes? Now, at this stage, which department did you consider was responsible for establishing that information? The Home Office as lead government department or DCLG Red?
Which information are you referring to? The name of the individual responsible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there are a number of bits of information, but yes, I mean, one can take that as the first point.
So I think it's absolutely right that was within DCLG's responsibility, both as the lead department for local authorities and because of their red responsibilities, and of course because they would be lead on the recovery operation, which is what we were heading into on this Friday.
Just in relation to conduits of information, would you have expected to receive that information from the DCLG Red, given their role as a link between local responders and central government?
Yes, I think that would be normal, yes.
Right, so not the Home Office then?
No, I think the Home Office here are doing the right thing. Their minister has received a piece of information. They're asking their DCLG colleagues for the answer to that question rather than cutting across them.
Right. And would you have expected that information to have been established by this point? This is morning of the 16th.
I would certainly expect the lead to be a known person, yes.
Yes. Now, if we go, please, to CAB 30120037, you forward an email at 9:02 if you say, so I'm so sorry, if you go to page 1 of this, foot of page 1, you can see you sent an email at 9:02 to Catherine Richardson and Gillian Kay. Would a catch-up, forwarding, would a catch-up mid-morning suit you guys, perhaps 10:30?
Yes.
And then there's a follow-up email. You say at the very top of the email string, and this is at 9:29, it would be good to catch up on the focus for the afternoon and also on the move to recovery. Did you end up having the catch-up with Miss Kay and Ms Richardson ahead of the ministerial meeting of that day?
I'm afraid I can't recall. We would have been talking throughout this period. I'm afraid I don't recall that specific conversation.
Right. And then if we go to CAB 401152, you can see the second email down on page 1 there is from the Home Office to you, copy to number 10, and the DCLG, Catherine Richardson. But it's also a copy to others in the Home Office, like David Lamberti, who was and Linda Grattan, Lorna Grattan, at number 10. And it says, Catherine, thank you so much for your time on the phone earlier this morning. As we discussed, in advance of the meeting this afternoon, the Minister would be really grateful if the Secretariat could pull together a written summary of what we are doing across the system to, 1, support victims, 2, provide support for emergency services personnel, 3, action taken so far to identify and check similar buildings, 4, action taken so far to rehouse people, and what is our common understanding, DCLG, RBKC, of the commitment to rehouse people locally, 5, action taken so far to reassure people about their fire safety, and 6, an update on access to cash and how it's working on the ground, stroke any updates from local banks. We've touched on all these questions over the last 2 meetings, but the Minister thinks it would be helpful to have a summary that we can work through point by point. He feels it is important that we use this meeting to really stress test the reality on the ground, given the conflicting reporting, as this is likely to be the handover meeting before we switch into recovery mode. Would that be possible? Thanks again, Deborah. Now, just looking at the last part of that, bottom of page 1, top of page 2, where it said that the Minister felt it was important that you use the meeting to really stress test the reality on the ground, given the conflicting reporting. What was your understanding of what that was meant by that?
So obviously the Minister had received some direct feedback from people on the ground, which was referred to in the email chain you took me to before. I think the conflicting reporting is just referring to different accounts of how well parts of the response were going. So there'd obviously been some reassurance the previous day that things were in hand. That sits at odds with accounts he was receiving from on the ground. So I think that's what that's referring to. The fact that there wasn't a sort of a single established version of that at that time.
Right. Was there a growing concern at this point that those involved at a central government level did not have an accurate insight into the reality of the issues on the ground with respect to survivors and affected residents?
I think we're always concerned to make sure that we've got the most accurate possible picture. That those concerns had arisen after the meeting the previous day. We talked before about the issues around data and numbers. So yes, I think we were concerned about that information at this point.
Now, I want to ask you about DCLG. Can we go to CAB 401150? And if we go to page 1 at the foot of page 1, we can see an email from Peter Tallentire at 9:10 in the morning to the CCS and you specifically. And he says this: I've been reflecting on the fire and next steps. A few quick thoughts which may be already be in hand or deemed unnecessary in light of discussions so far, I should say, which I'm largely unsighted on. And then he says, if we go over to page 2, please, point 5 of a number, And he says, and it's the first of the 2.5s there, I think ministers will need to meet at least once over the weekend, or they risk getting crucified, as they will need to be on top of the detail and able to assure media/public that they are doing everything to address the wider problem. So no let up over the weekend. We should plan/staff accordingly. Now, in response to that point, we can see your email, please, if we go back to page 1. You can see your response there at 9:22, back to Peter Tallentire, and in the last paragraph, you say, on the weekend, I think the general feeling is we shift from response to recovery after today. Most of the issues are now the longer-term ones. Perhaps a call over the weekend would do it. And then in brackets you say, I fear otherwise CLG may fall over, in brackets. First, why did you think a call would be sufficient over the weekend rather than a further ministerial meeting?
Well, I mean, a call doesn't presume that it's not ministerial. It's perfectly possible to draw ministers together on a call, and that would be normal practice. So I think I'm just testing whether we need to bring people together in person versus do it on the telephone.
I see. Did you appreciate the extent of the concerns with the local response at the time?
Yeah, I think I was certainly cited on concerns about the provision of accommodation, as we've already discussed, yes.
What did you mean by otherwise CLG may fall over?
I can't recollect entirely. I suspect I'm just reflecting it had been a very busy few days for a relatively small team, and we would want to protect capacity for what was clearly going to be a long-running response.
Yeah, I mean, did you have concerns about DCLG's capacity to deal with the issues that had been identified?
Not I don't think, beyond what I've just said.
Well, is that right? I mean, you say you wanted to protect the capacity. I mean, I fear otherwise CLG may fall over. Isn't that the same thing in a sense? That you were concerned, is this right, that there was a risk at least that CLG may lack capacity?
I think I'm just reflecting that it is not a gigantic team. It was very well organised to do things, running in shifts. This was a response which was obviously running, pretty much from very early in the morning to very late at night. So I'm reflecting that, that is stretching for the team.
Yes. And did you take any steps to consider providing or coordinating further steps for that team, the DCLG team?
They're not within my responsibility, I'm afraid. The support that we did provide over to DCLG was in the form of Ian Whitehouse, one of my deputy directors, who went across to support the recovery effort.
Right. What was the mechanism available to you to address your concern about the need to protect the DCLG's capacity?
So the capacity of DCLG and the Red Team was the responsibility of Gillian Kay, my counterpart over there. So I knew that she would be thinking about ensuring that the team had the right people in the right place.
You say Ian Whitehouse went across to support the recovery effort. Was that an ad hoc arrangement, or was that pursuant to a specific mechanism?
Sorry, could you just clarify, what do you mean by specific mechanism?
Well, was there a protocol, a practice, a procedure, a process in place written down on a piece of paper which would allow you to send one of your staffers to a government department?
No protocol. It was on the basis of a conversation with DCLG colleagues who said they would find it helpful to have someone of Ian's expertise helping them as they set up the recovery process.
And if we go to paragraph 64 of your first statement, page 18, you say there, perhaps we don't need to see it, it's a short point in paragraph 64, but you say there that DCLG is the liaison between local and national government in any crisis. It is also the government lead for local authorities. This comes back to a point we discussed yesterday. Was the DCLG always the liaison between local and national government in any crisis of whatever kind?
Yes, that's their one of their standing roles.
Right, and is always, as a standing role, the government lead for local authorities. I think you said that yesterday.
That's correct. It's within the department's policy responsibilities.
How effective did you think at the time DCLG was in their liaison function at this stage of the development of the crisis?
I think we were broadly getting the sort of information I would expect to get from liaison officers at this point. Certainly, we've provided the lessons learned documents to the inquiry, and on reflecting back, we concluded that it would be helpful to give those liaison officers some additional training and support in how to spot and raise overstretch in local authorities. So that is certainly a lesson taken from this event, and something that has been taken forward.
Yes, and we'll come to that later in your evidence. At this point, do you remember, had you raised any concerns with DCLG about, had you raised any concerns about DCLG with those more senior to you, for example, Paddy McGuinness or Mark Sedwill?
I would have to check the record. I'm afraid I can't recollect.
I want to turn next then, if I can please, to the appointment of John Barradell. And you say in your first statement at paragraph 68 at page 19 that you recall learning that morning from Mr. Bellamy that John Barradell had been appointed to take over from RBKC as Recovery Gold. You say that 3 lines down within that paragraph.
Yes.
And if we go to your third statement, please, page 14, paragraph 34, you clarify what you say here, and you say, I understood this to be a change of leadership rather than a change of the role of RBKC. Mr. Barradell took over responsibility for leadership of the recovery operation from Mr. Holgate. Was it your understanding at the time, in the light of what you say there, that was it your understanding of the LLAG arrangements that LLAG would assume the same executive authority and powers vested in the relevant chief executive, i.e. Nick Holgate?
Yes, I assumed that Mr. Barradell was acting on behalf of Mr. Holgate in respect of this area of his responsibilities. That was my understanding at the time.
What was the basis of that understanding?
I think the way I learned about this was through conversation with Mr. Bellamy, so that would be the basis.
Can you remember what he said to you?
Not in precise words, I'm afraid.
Now you say, in quite precise terms in your answer but one ago, that you assumed that Mr. Barradell was acting on behalf of Mr. Holgate in respect of this area of his responsibilities. Now you say you assumed that. What was that assumption based on?
Based on my conversation with Mr. Bellamy.
Well, was it your assumption or view, understanding perhaps, that Mr. Barradell had been delegated by Mr. Holgate to perform the obligations that he, Mr. Holgate, had as chief executive of RBKC as a Category 1 responder?
Not in their totality. So I understood that he had been appointed as Recovery Gold in relation to this event. So not taking over Mr. Holgate's general responsibilities, but in relation to this specific recovery operation that he was now leading it on behalf of Mr. Holgate.
Well, you say on behalf of Mr. Holgate. I just want to be clear. Was your understanding that he stepped into Mr. Holgate's shoes in respect of Mr. Holgate's responsibilities as chief executive of RBKC as a Category 1 responder?
Only insofar as they relate to this recovery operation.
So yes, in response to the Grenfell Tower fire?
Correct.
Right. What were the mechanics, did you understand at the time, by which Mr. Barradell received his delegation?
Very difficult to recollect the precise conversation I had with Mr. Bellamy. I think my basic understanding was that there had been a conversation at the Pan London level. It had been recognised, I think, including by RBKC, that they were in need of additional support. Mr. Barradell was very experience, one of the deputy chairs of the LRF, and identified as the right person to take that role.
Now, take that role. I just want to explore that. First, did you understand that Mr. Barradell, in taking that role, was there not to support Mr. Holgate in the discharge of his functions, but to take them over from him?
I understood that he was acting in Mr. Holgate's place in respect of the Grenfell Tower recovery operation. That's what I understood. So not reporting to him, no, but acting in his stead for this operation.
And reporting to whom?
Well, with responsibility back to the local authority, but not to Mr. Holgate specifically.
Who at the local authority?
I'm afraid you're beyond my level of intricate understanding.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to see if I can explore what the outer boundaries of that understanding were. Did you have a discussion at all with anybody, whether David Bellamy or anybody else, about what the mechanisms were by which Mr. Barradell received his power and authority to act?
I didn't have a detailed legal conversation. To my understanding, there was an existing arrangement by which this was possible. There were no legal issues or concerns raised.
Well, that leads to my next question. Did you understand at the time that this delegation, if you like, was being done pursuant to an existing framework?
I can't recall a specific conversation about the precise mechanics of how it had taken place, but certainly my conversation with Mr. Bellamy left me reassured that a sensible arrangement had been put in place. I would have expected that if the GLA had had concerns about the legitimacy of that, they would have acted on them.
Were you familiar at the time with the London Gold Resolution and its supporting documents?
I'm aware of it. I'm not familiar with every element of detail, no.
Was your understanding, however it came about, that the appointment of John Barradell to do what he was going to do, as you've described it, was within the terms of the London Gold Resolution and the arrangements at the time, or wholly novel? Outside it and wholly novel?
I'm afraid I don't recollect a specific conversation about that.
Now, your understanding, I think, was that the decision to appoint John Barradell as Recovery Gold on the 16th of June was made by the Mayor's office, or the Mayor's deputy, who chairs the LRF in London. I think that's what you say in paragraph 68. That's right, is it?
I think that was my understanding at the time, yes.
Yes. Do you accept now that your understanding was wrong and that the Mayor's office would have no power to make that appointment?
I mean, I don't think my understanding at the time was based on a sort of set of legal accountabilities. That was my understanding of how it had come about. So it wasn't a sort of legal judgment.
Right. I mean, was your understanding at the time that the Mayor had some kind of legally available mechanism whereby he could put John Barradell in post? Was that your understanding?
I think it was my understanding that RBKC were very happy with this arrangement and therefore content to delegate this role to Mr. Holgate. So the question of the Mayor's legal role, I don't think is something we discussed.
Well, that wasn't an answer, I'm afraid, to the question. My question was your understanding at the time that the Mayor was acting in accordance with some kind of mechanism, some established protocol or arrangement which empowered him to put Mr. Barradell into Mr. Holgate's place?
I'm afraid I can't recall a specific conversation about the protocol under which that had taken place, no.
Well, I think the question was, at the time, did you believe that the Mayor had the power to appoint Mr. Barradell to the role? What was your understanding?
Yes, at the time I thought Mr. Barradell was in the role perfectly legitimately and with consent of RBKC. So
yeah, but
the question of the Mayor's...
On the say-so of the Mayor, that was Mr. Millett's question.
So I don't think I understood at the time that this had been the Mayor's direction, but that this had been negotiated through the offices of the Mayor's office, is my understanding. Apologies, that's the distinction I'm trying to draw, but not very clearly.
So, whatever the precise position so far as the Mayor was concerned, was it your understanding that the Mayor had a material influence in the outcome, namely the takeover by Mr. Baradell from Mr. Holgate.
Yes, I understood that the Mayor's office had been involved in that discussion, yes.
Right. Can we look then at your precise language in paragraph 68 of your first statement, page 19? You say, in the middle of the paragraph, I understood this to mean, this is from your conversation with Mr. Bellamy, that he was taking over leading the recovery operation from Nicholas Holgate. For example, in relation to rehousing, CCS was not involved in the selection or appointment of John Baradell. My understanding was that this decision had been taken by the Mayor's office or by the Mayor's deputy, who chairs the LRF in London. I recall being pleased to learn of Mr. Baradell's appointment. And then you say this, as it indicated that my concerns regarding RBKC's apparent lack of plan for addressing the accommodation issues had been identified and acted upon. Acted upon by whom?
So I think what that sentence is reflecting is, firstly, pleasure that some action had been taken to replace the leadership. And secondly, I think my assumption at the time was that there had been a series of engagements with the local authority and with the GLA, not necessarily prompted by me, but prompted by the general concerns which had resulted in this action. So I don't think that refers to a specific individual. It refers to the system having resulted in a good outcome.
Right. Was it your understanding that Mr. Baradell was imposed on RBKC by the Mayor, by whatever route, or that RBKC had invited him to take over?
My understanding was that the arrangement was brokered by the Mayor's office, but that it was done with RBKC's consent. But again, this is based on quite a short conversation on the morning of the Friday.
Let's then turn to the correspondence from number 10 on that day. We were looking, I think, at CAB, and if we weren't, we should now. CAB 50473. And if we go to page 3 in this email run, please, we can see that at 10:50, halfway down your screen, Alistair Whitehead, at number 10, sends an email to the CCS and to you specifically, and also to the other PPSs, including Nicholas Hurd, as you can see, Office of Sajid Javid, Chancellor, and others. And if you go down it, it says all. The Prime Minister has decided that this afternoon's CCS ministerial meeting will now be the first meeting of the Prime Minister-chaired Grenfell Towers Recovery Task Force at 13:30 in 70 Whitehall. CCS will confirm with a calling notice with SOSs from DCLG, HO, DFE, DWP, MOJ, HMT, DH attending, along with the Policing and Fire Minister, Minister for London, operational partners and the Mayor of London, and RB, Kensington and Chelsea. Had the CCS been consulted about that decision in advance of this message?
I can't recollect, I'm afraid. I mean, normally Alistair would have been talking to Stuart Wainwright about the following meeting, so it's very possible they had a conversation about it. I'm afraid I can't recall.
What did you understand the status of this task force to be?
I understood it to be the formal evolution of the ministerial meeting process, so now specifically focused on recovery. The recovery practice is normally that a ministerial recovery group or task force, the word doesn't really make any difference, is convened at the moment where it is needed.
I mean, within the civil contingencies framework of legislation, regulation and guidance, what was this task force? Where did this sit?
It's a ministerial recovery meeting.
What's that? I mean, I know what that would mean ordinarily, but what is that in contingency lingo? Where does it sit in the framework? Is it something that's specifically contemplated by the regulation or by the statutory?
Not by regulation, but by in the doctrine. So, if a COBRA or a ministerial meeting is leading the response phase, this is its equivalent for the recovery phase. I think that's the most succinct explanation I can give you.
Right. Do you know what effort was made to make sure that this group, whatever you might call it, linked to the National London Civil Contingencies Framework, or did it not matter?
So this is the central government operation. Its link with the local would have been by inviting in attendees, as it says here in Alistair's email.
Now let's go to the witness statement of Lorna Grattan. Lorna Grattan, CAB 30s14853. And I'd like to go within it, please, to page 22, paragraph 64. Now, as I said, I think before this morning, or asked you about, I think, is it right, she was the private secretary to the Prime Minister with particular responsibility for matters relating to the DCLG and the CCS?
Just DCLG.
Just DCLG.
Yeah.
Right. And she says this in her statement at paragraph 64. It is my understanding that the Prime Minister decided to lead the government response to the Grenfell Tower due to the high priority she accorded to the need to ensure that the survivors were properly supported. The Prime Minister was acutely aware of the events surrounding the fire. The Prime Minister had attended the site of the fire herself, and she had been appraised of the information coming out of the Cross-Whitehall meetings. Was it your understanding that the Prime Minister was now leading the government response because the initial response had not been good enough in respect of the needs of survivors and families?
I don't think I can add to Lorna's evidence as to what was in the Prime Minister's mind, other than to say, I think at the time I assumed she wanted to assure herself on the points that Lorna raises here, and that is absolutely the Prime Minister's right and not unusual for them to step into and out of the chair of these kind of meetings.
Now, if we go back to your first statement, we can come then to the 1330 meeting chaired by the Prime Minister. If we go to page 20 of your first statement, paragraph 69, you say, at top of your screen, you say, at 9:50 a.m. I learnt from Alistair Whitehead, Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, that the Prime Minister had decided to chair the ministerial meeting that afternoon, which would be named the Grenfell Tower Recovery Task Force from this point onwards. The name, Grenfell Tower Recovery Task Force, was chosen by number 10. I believe it correctly reflected the fact that the balance of activity in dealing with the incident had shifted away from extinguishing the fire and was increasingly focused on what we would term recovery, specifically supporting the victims. Now, did you think that shifting the focus to victims 2 days after the fire, this is more than 48 hours after the 8 a.m. Moment, was too late?
No, so I don't think this is referring to any sort of start of a focus on victims. This is referring to the shift in emphasis of the meeting. So in the early hours on the 14th and the 15th, during the response phase, there were obviously immediate considerations in the response, which by this point had diminished. So, for example, the fire had been extinguished. So in terms of shift in emphasis, supporting the victims was now, the single focus.
Right. Now you say you use the expression shift in emphasis. That's how you saw it, is it?
Yeah. So often recovery and response operations, effectively start in parallel. There's not normally an absolutely clear dividing line between them, although sometimes there is. So generally the way that manifests is a shift in emphasis from managing the immediate set of issues on the ground into thinking about the long-term needs and requirements, particularly of those affected. So that's what I mean by shift in emphasis.
Yes. And did that indicate to you that the transition had been made to the recovery phase from the response phase?
Yes.
And was DCLG now the lead government department?
Yes, so they had been, from the start of the incident and on a pre-agreed basis, the lead for recovery. So that responsibility was unchanged.
Yes, but they may not have known about the view about the shift. From what you could tell at the time, was DCLG aware that they had now, or were about to become now, the lead government department?
I mean, they were already the lead government department, and they were already actively engaged in thinking about recovery. So I think the basis of your question is not quite right for me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then let me re-put it again. Were they aware that they were going to become the most prominent, the primary lead government department, because of the shift in emphasis now to recovery?
As soon as that decision had been taken to retitle the mechanism the Recovery Task Force, then yes, that would have been very clear to them.
Now, let's go to your first statement, please, page 20. Now, in paragraph 70 of your statement there, you say that the meeting was to be chaired by the Prime Minister, did not materially affect CCS's preparation for the meeting. The Home Office remained the lead government department for the response at this time. As it did for the previous two meetings, CCS drew up the attendees list, briefed the chair, drafted the agenda, and updated the CRIP. CRIP, we've heard a lot, and has been, I think, identified as it's the commonly recognised information picture.
Correct.
And is that a notion, an idea that's specific to CCS responses, or is it a wider acronym used more commonly across government?
It's used whenever the crisis response machinery is activated, whether that's a CCS-led response or by other parts of Cabinet Office.
Right.
So it's a common piece of doctrine.
And what was the role of the Home Office at this stage? Was it still lead government department in response to the response?
Correct.
Right. Was there clarity about when the formal transition to the recovery phase occurred?
So I think the creation of the Recovery Task Force marked that formal shift in emphasis. But as I explained a moment ago, in effect, these two responsibilities were running in parallel in those first few days. And of course, the Home Office responsibility didn't completely end with the start of recovery. So really the titling of the ministerial forum reflects the primary focus of the meeting rather than the end of one thing and the start of another. I hope that makes sense.
Right. Well, let me show you something. CAB 401150. This is an email we looked at earlier, and I showed you this. If you look at your email to Peter Talentire of 9:22 on the morning of the 16th, in the last paragraph, you say, on the weekend, I think the general feeling is we shift from response to recovery after today. So was it clear in your mind that the 16th would still be a day when Home Office was the LGD, that was the primary LGD, but after the 16th it would switch to DCLG being the primary LGD?
I think in effect it's happening through the course of that day as we move more clearly into recovery mode. As I say, there often isn't a moment in which that occurs.
Let's then go to the minutes of the meeting. CAB 402726. And the meeting is entitled Grenfell Tower Recovery Task Force. Minutes of ministerial meeting on Grenfell Tower fire. Conference room F, 70WH, at 13:30, Friday, 16th of June. WH is Westminster Hall, is it?
Whitehall. So
Whitehall.
The Cabinet Office building.
Right. And present, the chair, and you can see it's the Prime Minister, and others present, some familiar names there. And if you look down, you can see Nick Hurd is also there. You are there, left-hand column, as is David Bellamy, Mark Sedwill, and other familiar names. And if you turn on, please, to... well, can I ask you, conference room F at 70 Whitehall, is that one of the Cabinet Office briefing rooms?
Yes, it forms part of that suite, yes.
Now, given that the Cabinet Office briefing rooms are the physical location from which the central response is activated, and you'll know that that's paragraph 3.1 of CONOPS, does this indicate that COBRA had been activated on the 16th of June?
No, although the COBRA suite is often where COBRAs are run from, you can activate the central response in practice from any location. This was very clearly a recovery meeting which happened to be taking place in those rooms.
Right, why in those rooms and not the same rooms that the meetings on the afternoons of the 14th and the 15th of June?
I honestly can't remember. It may have been availability or convenience of the location. I wouldn't attach any significance to it.
Right. Let's look at CONOPS again, please, if we can. That's CAB 6026, page 9. We'll come back to the minute of the meeting in a moment, but I just want to take a sideways look, if I can, please, with you. Look at paragraph 1.10 in the middle of your screen there. And the last sentence in that paragraph says, in practice, the level of central government engagement may change over time, both up and down, as the demands of the emergency change. Now, that's obviously correct. Had there been a change, up or down, by 13:30 on the 16th?
Compared to when?
Compared to the 14th or the 15th?
Yes, I think central government engagement was, or responsibilities were increasingly engaged as we headed into recovery. Particularly, DCLG was by this point, I think, very heavily involved in looking for sources of accommodation, long-term accommodation.
Right. Then let's go, in light of that answer, to Annex B, which we looked at yesterday, in CONOPS, page 68. There it is. And it charts the likely form of central government engagement based on the impact and geographic spread of an emergency in England. The question I have is on this at this point. Did the Prime Minister, in convening the Grenfell Tower Recovery Task Force and deciding to chair it on that day, represent an escalation in the central government's response for the purposes of this graph, or this chart?
So this chart refers to response and not recovery. The Prime Minister, of course, took the chair of the Recovery Task Force. And I certainly think it reflects an increased focus from her in terms of wanting to assure herself that that actions were being taken forward promptly. But this chart refers to response rather than recovery, I think.
The title doesn't. It just refers to engagement. But are you referring, when you say it refers to response, to the words within the chart?
So COBRA is obviously a response rather than a recovery mechanism.
I see. So is it the case that COBRA is about the response but not about the recovery?
Yes, although as I said before, those two things can often run in parallel. So COBRA sometimes does take forward elements of recovery.
Well, that's the point. Exactly. Was there, in her chairing the meeting, an escalation in the response part of the engagement of central government, if I can use a neutral word?
I don't think there was an escalation in the response, no. I think government had a bigger role in recovery than it did in response for reasons that we discussed previously. Right.
So was one of the reasons why COBRA, as I think you say, wasn't activated on the 16th of June, is that the response was either over or was fading, and we were now increasingly into a recovery mode?
I don't think there was a reason to activate anything additional on the 16th of June called COBRA, because the issues that we're aware of would be taken forward through the Recovery Task Force.
Let's then go to the attendees list at CAB 402728. This is we've seen the list of those recorded present, but we have a more detailed list here, and you can see that it's an email at 16:25 on the 16th of June. which is being sent on pursuant to a request. And if you scroll down, please, to page 2 in this email, you can see who was there from number 10. And you've got some 7 staff from number 10 at this meeting. Is it, or was it, standard practice to have so many number 10 officials in attendance at a ministerial meeting?
I mean, the Prime Minister would Prime Ministers in general tend to bring members of their staff with them to these meetings. I haven't gone back and counted how many were normal, but you can see that the spread of responsibilities that were engaged are reflected here. So Alistair in relation to the Home Office and the response element, which was the shift in emphasis away from, but still there. Lorna in relation to the recovery, for example. So I think the people who are there reflect the people she obviously felt she wanted to support her.
Yes, it's a matter of impression, obviously, but was it your impression, given the number and identity of the number 10 staffers that the Prime Minister brought to the meeting, of the level of engagement that number 10 was intending to take?
I don't think I would have drawn a specific inference. I think the fact that the Prime Minister had decided to chair the meeting herself was a good indication that she was engaged and placing a lot of importance on these activities. I
mean, cutting through this, was it your impression, given that she essentially requested the meeting, had decided to chair it herself and brought 7 staffers, senior staffers from number 10 with her, that she was taking charge of the recovery?
Yes, I mean, it's always the Prime Minister's right to do so.
But
not taking on departmental responsibilities, no. But taking the chair of the meeting.
Well, that she, as Prime Minister, was taking charge of the recovery.
I want to be really precise in my response. So I don't think she was taking on the role of a lead government department into number 10, no. I think she was chairing the meeting to assure herself that the recovery was being taken forward by departments involved as it should be. So certainly taking the lead in that respect, but not taking charge in respect of taking on others' responsibilities. Sorry, that seems like a complicated answer, but I'm just trying to be precise.
So did you think she was there on an information gathering mission, or a mission to propel action?
I think she was there on a mission to ensure that the right actions were being taken, yes.
Let's go to the minute again, please, which is at CAB 402726. And let's look at page 2. That's CAB 402726, page 2, item 1. And you can see that the heading is Current Situation and Support for Those Affected. The Chair welcomed everyone to the meeting and opened by explaining that she wanted to ensure that the government was providing the best package of support to victims and doing everything possible to assist those on the ground. Now, clearly, would you accept that this demonstrated a shift of focus, or shift of emphasis, if you like, in this meeting towards the needs of those affected, compared with the ministerial meetings on the 14th and 15th of June?
I think there's an increased focus here, yes, as the immediate response questions have been resolved.
Now, the meeting covered a number of topics. I'd like to take you through them. First, coordination and support from DCLG. If we go, please, to paragraph 3 on page 3, it says, the Secretary of State for the Department of Communities and Local Government said that while he could not provide absolute reassurance that there was genuine coordination on the ground, his department had already committed to deploying more people, which could only help the situation. Why could reassurance not be provided that there was genuine coordination on the ground?
I find it very difficult to give evidence on behalf of the Secretary of State as to why he said that. I'm very happy to go back and explore it, but my assumption would be that he didn't feel he had information which said that that was clearly the case.
Well, I'm really asking for your recollections of your own understanding at the time, rather than looking into his mind. To your way of looking at it at the time, so far as you can recall it, what was your understanding about why absolute reassurance could not be given about genuine coordination on the ground?
I think because of some of the issues we've rehearsed today, Mr. Millett, about uncertainty about whether victims were getting all the support that they needed at this time.
Were you concerned to learn that that kind of reassurance could not be given?
It's always of concern when there are elements of the response which don't appear to be functioning exactly as you would like, yes.
Right. When it says that his department had already committed to deploying more people, what was that? Who were the people who had been deployed or were to be deployed?
I can't recollect exactly who was to be deployed, but I think the gist of that is DCLG civil servants to provide direct support on the ground.
And let's go to page 2, please. I want to go back a bit. This is about accommodation for non-Grenfell Tower evacuated residents. If you look at item 2 of the minutes, update from government departments, housing, it records that the main focus here, as it goes on, the Secretary of State for the Department of Communities and Local Government explained that the focus right now was on ensuring that the families impacted are accommodated locally as quickly as possible. This should not be limited to those resident in Grenfell Tower, but should also include those residents in nearby homes within the cordon. The commitment to rehouse those affected locally was now defined as within Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council, KCBC, or neighbouring boroughs. Is it right that this was the first time that the needs of those evacuated residents in terms of accommodation, emergency accommodation, was acknowledged, at least by number 10 and the Cabinet Office?
No, I don't think so. I think this is just stating for clarity and for the record that that everybody within the cordon was included in that definition.
Now, to the best of your understanding at the time, who was responsible, did you think, for the needs of evacuated residents at this point? Was it RBKC or was it John Barradell?
So I think the responsibility in organisational terms was with RBKC. John Barradell, in the way we discussed before, was acting in a leadership role on their behalf.
Right. Did you detect, was there any discussion about prioritisation of those in Grenfell Tower over the needs of those in the surrounding blocks, the walkways, and other blocks like Treadgold House and Grenfell Walk?
I honestly can't recollect, I'm afraid.
Was there any discussion at this meeting about the role of the Tenant Management Organisation, the TMO, in facilitating the return of evacuated residents to the walkways and outlying blocks?
I mean, the role of the TMO had been raised very early in the response, so I think it's likely that their involvement could have been part of the discussion. I'm afraid I can't recall at this distance the exact conversation. Do
you recall whether any concerns had been expressed or were expressed at this meeting about whether it was appropriate that the TMO should fulfil the role of facilitating the return of evacuated residents?
I can't recall that, I'm afraid, no.
Did you have an understanding about what the role of the TMO was in the response or in the recovery?
So I understood them to be responsible for the management of Grenfell Tower on behalf of RBKC, and that their role in the recovery would therefore be part of the recovery effort being led by Mr. Barradell.
I see. Did you ask, or did you have an understanding about the relationship between the TMO and Mr. Barradell and how they would work together?
I can't remember asking about the specific mechanism. I think my assumption would be they would be part of his recovery group.
Can we go to page 6, please, paragraph 15? It says here, in discussion it was noted the urgency to get a list of all residents of the tower block, drawing on all available channels in order to get a view of the potential number of fatalities. There was also a need to consider the religious dimension of burials. Given the concerns that you had expressed, as we've seen, to DCLG the previous evening regarding Mr. Holgate's inability to provide estimates of occupancy, and you'll remember the ease with which you said it could be done, what was your impression of the extent of progress that had been made on that question up to that point?
I think it was an issue of concern that we still didn't have clarity on those numbers.
Did it surprise you at all that this was still a question?
I think it was certainly disappointing. I reflect that Mr. Baradell had been in the role for only a short number of hours at this point, so I wouldn't necessarily have expected that to be resolved immediately, but it's clearly an issue of concern in order to drive the response.
Could we then go to CAB 402727? This is your Exhibit 25, and it's the action list from this meeting, isn't it? I think it is.
Yes, correct.
Yes. Now, it covers a large number of actions. I just want to pick up some of them with you. Action 4, DCLG to set up a single integrated support service following the model of the Victims of Terrorism Unit to coordinate cross-government activity and provide those affected with a single point of access into central government. 5, DCLG to deploy a suitably experienced person to Gold Command to provide a direct link into central government. 6, DCLG to make £5 million available for discretionary payments. 7, DCLG single integrated support service working with the council to ensure support funds established were administered and funds dispersed effectively. And then if we go to the top of page 2, I'm summarising again as closely as I can to the text. Action 9 is that the council will develop with the DCLG an effective mechanism to ensure the coordination of offers of assistance and distribution of materials. Now, do you agree that this was the first time that this level of focus, at least within central government, was given to humanitarian assistance and support for those affected at the ministerial meetings?
I think it's certainly the largest number of actions under that heading.
Yes, all right. Now, looking down the list of Action 11, it says COBRA agreed that HMG should fund legal representation for affected families. If COBRA hadn't been activated, why was COBRA agreeing anything?
I apologise for that. I think that is shorthand which has been used by a colleague, probably because we were sitting in one of the briefing rooms, as you previously alluded to. It should read the Grenfell Tower Ministerial Recovery Task Force agreed. So I think that's just an admin error, for which apologies.
Right. Who was on this task force? Was this everyone at the meeting?
Yes, the task force was the name of the meeting.
So there's no force per se, just a meeting of people who call themselves task force.
I'm not sure I would agree with the statement. There's no force in a meeting chaired by the Prime Minister.
No, sorry. No, there was no force per se. In other words, there was no body of individuals, no collective comprising a task force.
I understand your question. Apologies. I didn't mean to be glib before. All of the attendees of that meeting would have been drawing on the capability in their own departments and organisations. Right.
So what I'm trying to understand is COBRA here a shorthand for the meeting agreed,
yes,
or is it shorthand for a number of people at the meeting?
No, COBRA is the wrong phrase. It should say that the Recovery Task Force, i.e. the meeting, agreed.
Right. I follow. Do you know how that error came to be made?
I think it's just a typing error from the person writing the actions. These go out quite quickly, and I apologise for it.
But did it indicate, or does it indicate, some degree of confusion about whether COBRA had been activated or not?
No, not at all. It's just an admin error.
But there's quite a difference, isn't there, between COBRA being activated and a meeting of ministers assembling not pursuant to the COBRA protocol. We've been through that yesterday. Can you explain why that mistake could have been made if there was that clarity?
I think because we were sitting in the facility in which a COBRA meeting is often held, as you rightly pointed out, COBR stands originally for Cabinet Office briefing rooms, a place it's now used to mean a mechanism, a meeting of people. So I don't think there's any confusion about the basis of the meeting. I think it's just an error based on sitting in that room.
Right. What was your impression of the progress made during this meeting compared with the progress made at the previous two ministerial meetings on the two previous days?
I think this is a good business-like meeting. It's a good list of actions. It addresses the issues which we were concerned about, and certainly the presence of, Mr. Barradell gave a degree of confidence that the local authority response was going to improve.
To your way of understanding at the time, did it make a difference that the focus had now shifted from response to recovery? In this sense, that it was easier to calmly plan for the medium term than it was to respond in the immediate aftermath?
No, I don't think it was easier at all. But I think it's the correct shift in focus at this point. Now that the immediate response, i.e. the extinguishing of the fire and evacuating of people from the building and the surrounding area had largely concluded.
Now, let's look at what happened after this meeting, which happened at 13:30. Let's go, please, to CAB 402898. Now, the timing of this is important. We can see at the foot of page 1 that Mark Sedwill sends you an email on the 16th of June 2017, and he says, Katharine, well done with today's meeting. It was clear that K&C are completely out of their depth, so we should probably have prompted a DCLG intervention earlier. But all that can come out via lessons learned, IDC. I'm assuming that stands for in due course.
It does, yes.
Shall I follow up with Melanie on London HMG support for K&C, or do you think all that is in hand? Now, first, what was Mark? We can see that Mark Sedwill was at the meeting. Was that because of his role?
Yes.
And do you agree with his assessment that RBKC were completely out of their depth?
I think I'd formed the view that they were overwhelmed on the meeting on the 14th.
Yes, overwhelmed, meaning the same thing as it is out of their depth.
I think in effect it's a different phrase, but the same thing.
Right. Did you share his opinion that CCS should probably have prompted a DCLG intervention earlier?
Well, I think with hindsight, clearly an intervention was justified. I think the only earlier time it could have happened would have been on the 14th itself. And at that time, I think the information coming through was not clear that any intervention was needed. So with the benefit of hindsight, might that have assisted? Yes. Based on the information we had at the time, it's difficult to understand how we would have done that. Right.
So, to be clear, hindsight at the time, in the sense of hindsight back from 16th of June to the 14th of June?
Yes.
Yes, I see. And that's because you didn't know on the 14th of June that K&C would end up out of their depth, but that was now clear by the 16th?
It was clear on the 15th, and so by the 16th, yes.
Very well. Now then, you reply to this. If we go up to page 1 higher up the screen, you say, "Hi Mark, this is at 15:58. We've been working with the Mayor's office on K&C. They were really effective in prompting the Barradell intervention, which is good. I spoke to Melanie before the meeting and put her in touch with Barradell. She's spoken to him and offered support. That's the RED officer, R-E-D officer, that was mentioned. So I think all okay there. Now, in what way had you been working with the Mayor's office on K&C?
I think that it just reflects the conversations with Mr. Bellamy that we talked about before.
I see. And what support did you understand had been offered by, Melanie, I imagine, is Melanie Dawes, is it?
It is correct, yes.
Right. What support did you understand had been offered by Melanie Dawes to John Barradell?
I didn't take part in that conversation, so I'm afraid I can't describe precisely what she offered, but the offer of an embedded senior person from RED, which I think was recorded in the actions of the meeting, is I think what's being referred to here.
Did you have any residual concerns about the response at that point?
There were clearly ongoing issues which had yet to be resolved, so yes, but I think the actions from the meeting felt like the right ones to address those concerns.
Now, if you go, please, to CAB 405339, we could pick this up just before 6 o'clock in the evening on the 16th of June 2017, the Friday. And if you look at the second email down on the screen, if we can have it enlarged, please. This is from Theresa May to Gavin Barwell, copied to others, but it, I think, comes in. Well, perhaps you don't see it. She emails number 10 staff, including Lorna Grattan, and she says this: the one message that came over from my meeting this PM loud and clear was about the utter uselessness of K&C Council. They haven't been communicating with anyone. They tried to shut down the church centre I was at, despite the centre housing people. There are people still without temporary accommodation, etc. I've tried to speak to the leader of the council, but no joy so far. Urgent thinking, please, about how we can ensure everything we need and agreed gets done. At least someone from the council could call the vicar of the church I went to and ask what is needed. Now, I don't know whether you saw this email chain at the time, but my question is, do you agree with Theresa May's assessment in that email?
I think that the point about RBKC being overwhelmed I agree with, and that's what she's reflecting in her first sentence. The church centre, I'm afraid I don't know what that refers to. I assume it is somewhere she visited, having been to the site the day before. Certainly correct that there were continued to be issues with accommodation. I'm afraid I can't speak to whether or not she successfully spoke to the leader of the council. And then the final two sentences, I think, are reflecting her desire to ensure that actions that had been agreed really are followed through and delivered. So, yes, I would agree with the need to do that.
Well, the exercise you've just gone through is reading and interpreting the email. Maybe the fault lies in my question, but my question is, was what Theresa May is telling Gavin Barwell and others on this email string consistent with your understanding of matters as they stood at the time?
Well, apologies. My taking it point by point, I think, indicates that there are elements there that were not familiar to me at the time, so I'm not familiar with what the church centre refers to, but the elements I highlighted, I think, are consistent with discussion at the meeting and therefore my understanding.
Right. Now, we can see Will McFarlane's response. He was a number 10 staff member, I think.
Deputy Principal Private Secretary.
Right, so a senior staff member, as one might expect from in an email of this nature. And he says, and it goes back to Theresa May and Gavin Barwell, PM, Lorna has immediately made contact with DCLG to play back this overwhelming message from your discussions. Specifically, we've instructed DCLG to bring together what additional resource they could quickly put in to the council and have it ready to go. We've told them to make contact with Gold Command in order to go round K&C and identify where we could immediately and helpfully place people. Now, those instructions to DCLG are clearly coming from number 10 here. Should they have come from the CCS?
I think this is number 10 adding its weight helpfully to the actions that came out of the meeting in the afternoon. There are some more specific suggestions in here, but it's obviously it's not unusual for number 10 to interact directly with departments like this.
No. Okay. And are these actions things which DCLG ought to have done earlier?
So I think that the first action, putting in additional resource, I think that was already something which was being talked about and actioned based on the record of the meeting. The Gold Command point, I would have to take away. I'm not entirely sure specifically what was behind that. Well,
what the phrase that's used is, and I know that's not your email, and you didn't draft it and didn't receive it, but
no.
What is said is we've told them to make contact with Gold Command in order to go round K&C and identify where we could immediately and helpfully place people. Was it your understanding that Gold Command was going to, as it were, circumvent K&C, or review K&C and look within it to see where they could put people?
As you correctly said, I didn't see this email at the time, so I didn't have any contemporary understanding. My assumption would be, reading it now, that the intention was to use Gold Command as a means of diagnosing what support might be helpful by talking to K&C.
Right. Then let's go to CAB 3011967. This is a little bit later, a few minutes later actually, at 18:25 on that evening, 16th of June, and it's Alistair Whitehead to you at 18:25, and he says, sorry, got an initial steer now. We are going to have another PM-chaired meeting tomorrow, sorry, given the seeming chaos on the ground due to RBKC not gripping this. We will then maybe do a call on Sunday, but hopefully not a full physical meeting. We'll be in contact with exact timing. Why did it take the Prime Minister's intervention for there to be a decision to have further meetings over the weekend, given the extent of the problems already identified with RBKC's response?
So absolutely normal practice is that the chair of the meeting, whether it's response or recovery, then takes the decision about what will happen next. I think that wasn't concluded in the meeting that afternoon, and the email exchange you showed between myself and Mark Sedwell, I think, confirms that. I was asking if he had managed to take the Prime Minister's view on this. So the email at the base of the screen here from myself to Alistair is me saying, this is our current assumption in the absence of that view, and then Alistair recounting, this is the Prime Minister's decision. So it's a normal course of process that the chair would decide what happens next.
Yes, the reason given for another meeting appears to be the seeming chaos on the ground due to RBKC gripping this. Were you surprised to learn that another meeting was required for that reason, given that John Barradell had by now been appointed and had taken over?
Not surprised, no. I think that reflects the tone of the meeting that afternoon and the need to ensure that the significant actions were followed through and the situation improved.
Let's then go to CAB 402932, which takes us later into that evening. This is now 2026. And at that stage, you can see that this is an email from Melanie Dawes to Mark Sedwill, into which you were copied, as well as people in number 10, as you can see. Mm-hmm. And it says, Mark, I know the PM has been very concerned about Kensington and Chelsea's capacity today. As I said in the margins of Cobra, John Barradell took over at lunchtime as Gold Command for the whole recovery, and he's just rung me with an update. He's clearly made very significant progress this afternoon, and I think we can now be assured that the situation is coming under proper control. Now, again, we see a reference to Cobra. Why was that? Do you know? If this wasn't a Cobra meeting?
I think for the same reason it appears in the actions list that it did take place in the briefing rooms and right. Almost certainly just being used as shorthand. There's no significance I would attach to that.
Well, right. And this comes from Melanie Dawes, who one might imagine would be familiar with the difference between a Cobra meeting and a non-Cobra meeting of ministers. Is that a fair comment? I'm
sure she would, but she's also writing at 8:30 in the evening after a busy day. I think it's entirely forgivable that she uses that shorthand.
Right. Did you agree with Ms. Dawes' assessment that you could now be assured that the situation was coming under proper control?
I was very pleased to see it. I think she had been in direct contact with Mr. Barradell, so I had no reason to doubt her assessment.
And then there is a list of bullet points, which I don't think I need to take you through, under key points. But they start. He has taken over the entire recovery operation. Parallel teams to the K&C ones are now in place on all fronts, including housing. And it continues in that vein. John has brought in heavyweight leadership. And then the last but one bullet point, moving the Humanitarian Crisis Centre and turning it into something much more professional looking, rather than the pillow and blanket approach of the sports centre. And then it goes on at the end, after the list of bullet points, some of which I've shown you. Mm-hmm. On K&C itself, John is clear that they are in a bad way, At official level, the gold structure manages this risk for the time being. It has basically taken over. At political level, other London councils are coming in with support. After the immediate crisis is over, we will clearly need to consider a long-term solution. Given the reported progress that was being made since John Barradell's appointment and the ongoing concerns with RBKC, did you think at the time that he should have been appointed into that role at an earlier stage?
I think my perception at the time was that that appointment had taken place pretty swiftly after concerns about RBKC had crystallised on the 15th. So I think with the, understanding how events unfolded, his earlier appointment, I'm sure, would have had a positive effect. I think my perception at the time was that it had happened pretty rapidly after it was clear there was a problem.
And then it goes on in the next paragraph. We've embedded RED response, RED response, and housing liaison into the local effort this afternoon, as well as helping on the ground. This will also ensure we start to get the information we need on rehousing, etc. We are also providing finance liaison from Monday at John's request. I've made sure that they know that finance is not an issue, and I'm confident that Nick Holgate understands this as well as John. Is it right that this intervention from DCLG took place on the afternoon of the 16th of June and coincided with John Barradell's appointment and the PM chairing the ministerial meeting?
So I think Mr. Barradell was appointed. I think you put to me earlier on the previous evening, so the evening of the 15th. I learned about that in the morning of the 16th. Exactly when the RED response arrived and was embedded, I'm afraid I don't know. You'd have to ask DCLG for the timing of that.
Do you accept that the DCLG could have implemented these actions before the 16th of June?
Well, I mean, that's certainly possible. I think they were responding to their understanding of what was required at the time.
Did you or anyone else at the CCS suggest that DCLG should be taking these steps before John Barradell's appointment and before the Prime Minister's 13:30 meeting on that day?
I can't recollect, I'm afraid.
Now, there's a reference to John Barradell taking over the entire recovery operation. Was your understanding that that included responsibility for residents from the wider cordon as well as those from Grenfell Tower itself?
Yes.
Yes. Now, let's move forward in time to September 2017 for a moment. And we'll go, please, to CAB 30s14768. Now, this is a document entitled Grenfell Tower Tragedy, Lessons for the Central Response. And I think, am I right in thinking this was authored by the CCS?
Yes. So this was pulled together by CCS with input from all of the departments who would have been involved.
Yes. There was a cross-government feedback arrangement.
Exactly.
System. Right.
Yes.
Now, if we go... Excuse me. If we go to page 3, please, paragraph 12, which starts, "Crips were issued daily." Just after halfway down that paragraph, it says, after the bracket, "There was also uncertainty over the respective role of the Council and Recovery Gold. Cobra understood that the latter, John Barradell, had taken control of the response on the ground, but it subsequently transpired that he was only responsible for the residents of the tower itself, not all those affected in the wider community or adjacent properties, which remain the responsibility of RBKC." Are you able to help us about how and when it subsequently transpired that Mr. Barradell was only responsible for the residents of the tower itself as opposed to the wider community or adjacent properties?
I'm not, I'm afraid. I was, my understanding at the time was that he was responsible for both throughout in his role at Recovery Gold. So I think this report is reflecting different understandings of that, but that was not my understanding, that his role split out in that way.
Right. When did you first discover that it had been? Was it when we read this? Well, I'm assuming you did read this.
I did read this after the fact, obviously, yes.
After the fact. Yeah. Well, did you have any contribution to it? Did you have any input into this document?
can't specifically recollect. I mean, normally I would provide my views in the same way as other people in CCS.
Did you consider, either at the time or later, that the uncertainty that has emerged about the scope of John Barradell's role contribute to the ongoing problems relating to evacuated residents?
As I say, I wasn't aware of uncertainty about his role at the time.
Let's then turn to the following days then, starting with the Saturday of the 17th of June. On that day, I think you'll recall that there was a further Prime Minister chaired meeting.
Correct.
And that happened at 11 a.m. Yes?
Correct.
And that you attended, yes?
Yes.
And if we go to the minute, it's at CAB 402735. And you can see who was present. It included John Barradell by telephone. If you turn to page 2, please, you can see by teleconference you have Philip Hammond, John Barradell and Mark Sedwill. And if you go on, please, to the bottom of page 2, scroll to the bottom, paragraph 5, in discussion the following main points were raised. And if you go over to the top of page 3, you can see a set of bullet points, 5 bullet points. First, residents were unsure how to access services and support and needed help to do so. Officials with high visibility jackets or similar should be deployed to the area to advise members of the community how to get the support they needed. It would be important to explain that it would take time to announce the final number of fatalities due to the challenges surrounding body retrieval and identification. And some members of the public may be reluctant to come forward as they may not have been legally registered at Grenfell Tower. The government should ensure that these individuals are reassured that no action will be taken against them, and a meeting planned with members of the local community later that day. It was important that the government and Recovery Gold were represented to hear directly from those affected and answer questions on the response. Now, one of the continuing issues through the week was the lack of clear information and signposting of support for survivors, residents and bereaved. Is that right?
I think, as recorded here, it's completely correct. The lack of clarity on how exactly to access support was a continued issue, yes.
And if we scroll down, please, to the foot of the page, under item 2, update on key actions, A, coordination of government support for those affected. 8 says this: Recovery Gold provided an update on the coordination of local recovery. And then if you look at little 1, it says, of the 845 individuals who had been evacuated, some had now returned, many were unable to return, and some had chosen not to return. Rehousing efforts had been prioritised according to 2 categories: residents of Grenfell Tower, Category A, and residents displaced from the wider community, Category B. Work was underway to rehouse those displaced to properties appropriate to family size and need. Offers would be made to families on Monday. Now, you can see the prioritisation that's identified to the meeting there, and that was what John Barradell was telling you. Do you know who had decided on that priority?
I don't, I'm afraid.
Was your understanding that those categories were to be treated equally, A and B, or was A to be given priority over B?
I think my understanding was that the categorisation reflected that they were likely to have different needs and requirements, and therefore they had been grouped in that way.
Right, so they were categorised by reference to difference in need, not by reference to difference in prioritisation. Was that your understanding?
I think so, but to be honest, my recollection is not very clear.
And then if we go to CAB 402980, now this takes us late into the day on the 17th of June. It's an email, if you go to the foot of page 1 and over to page 2, from Mark Sedwill to the office of Melanie Dawesman. If you go over to the top of page 2, you can see you are copied in on it. Mm-hmm. And it's timed at 23:47 on the 17th of June. I'm afraid I didn't show you that at the foot of page 1, but take that from me. And he says this: hi Melanie, thanks. I was on the phone at today's Cobra. A few points struck me. And just pausing there, again, now we see Mark Sedwill himself referring to this meeting as a Cobra meeting. Was this another error, or was this evidence of some kind of confusion?
No, I don't think it's confusion. It's just a shorthand for a meeting of this type.
Right.
In the same way that Melanie Dawes used it.
Right. And he says, a few points struck me, and then the second one down. John B's sense of grip was palpable, so I hope the situation on the ground will now gain and demonstrate some momentum. But, ... third bullet point, do we need a gold for Whitehall on all the wider issues, or maybe a gold plus gold minister, e.g. Joe Farrar, plus Greg Hands? I think it's a reference to Dr. Joe Farrar. They would have to drop everything else. I fear this will become our New Orleans otherwise. First, what did you understand Mr. Sedwill to mean by "I fear this will become our New Orleans otherwise"?
I think I understood him to mean that that the response would not be adequate to meet needs at the time.
And was this a reference to the criticisms of the White House that had arisen as a result of the United States central government's handling of Hurricane Katrina?
I assume so, but you would need to confirm that with Mark.
But I'm just asking about your understanding as one of the people
Yes.
who received this email at the time.
That was my interpretation, yes.
Right. Thank you. Secondly, the concept of gold for Whitehall, or gold plus gold minister, was that a concept, was that new, or was that written into the existing contingency frameworks?
No, so I don't think that is a standard sort of concept that exists in the doctrine. Gold is normally used, particularly by the police but other first responders, to refer to the person in strategic command of a particular operation. I think Mark is drawing on his understanding of that framework and using that term to describe the sort of role that he thinks is needed.
I see. Thank you. We'll come to the 18th of June after the lunch break, which I'm now going to ask the Chairman. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, it is, Mr. Millett. Well, we'll come to it, I think, at 2 o'clock, please. We'll break there, as I say, resume at 2 o'clock. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence over the break.
Okay.
All right? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 2 o'clock, then, please. Thank you.